All right, picture this. I'm at home, staring down at my phone, and it hits me that I'm waiting for a notification. Not a text, not an email, but a notification from my laundry app. See, I'd stuffed my clothes into the washer in my building's basement, hit start on my phone, and now I'm on my couch, waiting for that satisfying little buzz that says, laundry complete. I don't even have to leave the apartment to know when it's done. It's like I've outsourced the simple act of checking on my own clothes. And there's this strange comfort in it, this tiny thrill of convenience. I mean, laundry, one of the oldest, simplest chores, has been transformed into a thing that I can monitor from my couch while scrolling aimlessly through my feed. It feels so normal to me now that I barely give it a second thought. But really, when did I reach this point where even the most basic tasks are handled by notifications, where I'm reminded to do things that, once upon a time, I wouldn't have needed reminding of? Then I think about the other small ways that my life has become this curated, hands-off routine. Take my groceries. I don't remember the last time I strolled through an aisle, just tossing things into a cart. Now, every Sunday morning like clockwork, I get a message saying, hey, it looks like you might be low on peanut butter, or time to restock your favorite yogurt. I barely even keep track of what I need anymore, because my grocery app does it for me. It's all algorithmically assembled, like someone sneaking into my kitchen at night to take inventory. I get a strange kick out of just pressing order on my essentials, as if some kind of invisible butler is handling my pantry. And the funniest part? I hardly ever notice it happening. My food just shows up. Or take my music. There's this daily playlist that appears each morning, curated with an eerie accuracy that feels like it knows my mood before I do. If it's a dreary Monday, I'll get these soft, low-key tracks to ease me into the week. If it's a Friday afternoon, I'll get a Friday vibe playlist with upbeat, feel-good songs that I'd never think to play myself, but end up loving. I remember when making a playlist meant sitting down, sifting through albums, picking out the right songs. Now, it's done before I even wake up, like my phone's been anticipating the soundtrack of my life while I'm still asleep. And then there's how I see my friends. I say see because in reality, I'm watching their lives like mini movies on my phone. I know where they went on vacation, what they had for brunch, the new plants they bought, all without actually talking to them. It's this silent, spectator version of friendship where I can know every small detail without being in the room. If one of them posts a picture of their new dog, I'll send a heart emoji and they'll reply with a laughing face or maybe a thumbs up. It's brief, it's low-key, and somehow it still counts as keeping in touch. What's strange is that these little interactions feel oddly fulfilling. I don't know if it's the quickness of it or just the fact that we're all doing it, but it's like we're all in this silent pact to keep things casual. We're connected, but not in each other's faces. I know what's going on, I know they're happy or doing well, and that's enough. It's like we've collectively decided that friendship in 2024 is a constant, quiet thumbs up across the digital void. And birthdays? They're a masterpiece of minimal effort now. I'll get a notification in the morning. It's Danny's birthday today. I'll tap the message, type happy birthday, and maybe if I'm feeling wild, throw in a confetti emoji. 30 seconds max and I've done my part. No gifts, no card, not even a phone call. Just a quick message, like blowing out a single candle on someone else's cake. And the wildest part? It's enough. Danny will reply with, thanks, and we're good. Somehow, we've distilled celebration into the simplest of gestures, and it feels sufficient. Even my entertainment has been streamlined. I'll open a streaming app, and it'll show me what I might like based on what I've already seen. Half the time, I'll end up watching something the algorithm picked for me, without even glancing at the hundreds of other shows I could choose from. The freedom of endless options is great, but honestly, I'll let the app decide most of the time. It's like having a TV guide that's tailored to my exact preferences, and I trust it so completely that I barely even question it anymore. I'll hit play, and it's like I'm in the passenger seat of my own entertainment. And you know what? I think that's the heart of it. This feeling of being gently guided, like I've set up my life to handle itself, as if my phone has become this soft, invisible framework that I can lean on. There's a sort of warmth in it, like the modern world is giving me a gentle nudge forward one notification at a time. Laundry's done. Time to reorder milk. Your friend went hiking. These little blips of information that trickle in throughout the day, quietly structuring my life without demanding too much from me. Now, I get that it's not all positive. Sometimes I feel like I'm on autopilot, just drifting along, never quite needing to think about what comes next because the notifications already have it covered. There's a part of me that wonders if I'm missing out on something real, something tangible. Like, what would happen if I turned off the apps and actually had to keep track of my own groceries or text my friends instead of liking their stories? Would I feel more engaged, more present? Maybe. But then again, there's something sweet about the way life just flows like a stream, carrying me along little by little. So here I am, sitting on my couch, waiting for my phone to tell me my clothes are ready to be switched to the dryer, marveling at the simple joy of just being in sync with this odd, automated rhythm. It's a strange, funny way to live, but somehow it works. This gentle digital choreography, guiding me through the day with reminders and pings and playlists, keeping me connected to everyone without any grand effort. And it makes me wonder, what's that one notification you get that's become a tiny but essential part of your day, something that would feel oddly empty without it? This morning, I woke up to the soft sound of raindrops on the roof. A dreary start, or so I thought, until I realized that the rain was falling just to the right of my window, like a protective curtain sheltering my view. Not a single drop was hitting my window directly. I leaned closer, watching the rain form a perfectly clear circle around my house, dry and bright within. It felt as though the world was saying, "Today's for you." I stepped outside, umbrella-less, half expecting to be hit by the rain as soon as I left the porch. But the rain shifted with me, politely parting to let me pass, as if it were making room for me on the sidewalk. I couldn't help but laugh, feeling like I'd been gifted some kind of invisible charm. When I got to the coffee shop on the corner, the line was gone, unheard of for this time in the morning. As I reached the counter, the barista greeted me with a bright smile. "You're our 1,000th customer this month," she announced, and before I could process it, she handed me a little card. "Free coffee for a week. Enjoy." "Are you serious?" I laughed, not sure if this was a prank, but she nodded, grinning as she handed me my coffee. I walked out feeling like the universe was setting me up for something good, wrapping me in a bit of grace, like a warm, invisible cloak. The world outside seemed unusually cooperative. The rain stopped altogether as I walked, and a little patch of blue sky opened up directly above me. I felt like I was walking in my own spotlight. People around me carried umbrellas, huddled under awnings. Yet there I was, walking in perfect clarity. A kid even pointed at the sky, tugging his mother's sleeve and whispering, "Look, he's in a magic bubble." She laughed, but gave me an odd smile too, like she almost believed him. At the corner, a car splashed through a puddle, but the water seemed to pause midair, parting just enough to avoid me. I stared in shock as the driver waved apologetically, his eyes wide at the physics-defying splash. I nodded back, feeling both amused and a bit like the star of a bizarre movie where everything just went my way. By the time I reached work, I'd almost gotten used to the day's lucky streak. I stopped by the lobby cafe to pick up a muffin, reaching for the last one in the display case, when a colleague came up beside me, eyeing it longingly. Before I could step aside, the barista brought out a fresh batch. "Just in time," she said, setting down a tray of muffins that looked especially delicious. "Go ahead," I said, offering my colleague the last one in the case. He gave me a grateful nod, grabbing it before it vanished. "Wow, you're a lifesaver," he said, and it felt like a little reward, like my generosity was being repaid by the universe itself. The elevator doors opened right as I stepped up, and there was my boss smiling. "Hey, just the person I was hoping to see," she said, ushering me in. "I heard your proposal went over well last week, so we're fast-tracking it for review. I want to talk it over today." She gave me a thumbs up as we reached our floor. "Good luck," she said, stepping out. The doors closed, and I stood there, almost in disbelief. The meeting itself felt surreal. Every question I'd prepared for was asked. Every answer landed perfectly, and by the end, the lead reviewer looked at me and said, "I think you've got something special here. Let's move forward." I walked out feeling a little dazed, like I'd been carried through on an invisible wave of support. When I left the office, the rain had returned, but just as I stepped outside, a taxi pulled up right at the curb. "Need a lift?" the driver asked with a friendly nod. I hadn't planned on taking a cab, but he looked so insistent. I climbed in. The driver seemed to know exactly where I was headed, and within minutes, I found myself at my favorite bookstore, a little place I hadn't visited in ages. It felt like fate, so I went inside, browsing through the stacks. I was just running my fingers along a shelf when a slim, leather-bound journal tumbled off a high ledge, landing open at my feet. A note was written inside the cover. For anyone who finds this, you're exactly where you're meant to be. I picked it up, flipping through blank, cream-colored pages that begged to be filled. A sense of calm settled over me, the feeling of having stumbled on something quietly profound. As I bought the journal, the cashier gave me a curious look, smiling as she slipped it into a bag. "That one's on the house," she said, almost conspiratorially. "Something tells me it's meant for you." I walked home through the rain, journal tucked under my arm, feeling wrapped in an inexplicable peace. When I reached my building, the raindrops around me slowed, almost pausing, and I took a breath, just standing there, basking in the stillness. At home, I opened the journal and picked up a pen, feeling like I was writing for the first time in years. And as I put down the first few words, a little voice in my mind whispered, "Today was a gift. Remember this feeling. Maybe tomorrow would be ordinary, but today felt like a miracle. A day that had unfolded itself, layer by layer, just for me. I didn't need to understand it. I just had to be grateful." And I was. If you had a day where everything went your way, what would you do with it? So, here's a story I didn't expect to tell, all because of a chair. Last month, I was helping a friend move apartments, which, as we all know, is the universal sign of true friendship. We were in the last stages of the move, sweaty, covered in dust, and exhausted when we got to the last item in the hallway. A small, scruffy-looking armchair that she'd apparently had forever. I mean, this thing was worn out. The fabric was faded and fraying. The arms were a little wobbly, and the whole chair had this very loved but abandoned vibe. My friend glanced at it and shrugged. "Want it?" she asked, half joking. Now, every sensible part of me was saying, "No, you do not want this old chair. You do not need this old chair. My apartment is already small, and I definitely don't need more clutter." But then I looked at it again and thought, why not? Something about it seemed inviting, I guess. So, in a fit of impulse and possibly mild heat exhaustion, I said, "Sure, I'll take it." When I got it home, I kind of regretted the decision right away. It looked even shabbier under my own lights, and I figured it would probably just sit in the corner collecting dust until I finally admitted it was time to let it go. But that night, after I'd finally showered and eaten, I wandered over to it and decided to give it a try. I plopped down, expecting to feel the lumps and creaks of an old chair past its prime. But something surprising happened. It was oddly enough incredibly comfortable, like sink into and get lost comfortable. It felt like I'd settled into this perfect cocoon, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, I just relaxed. I don't know if it was the exhaustion from moving or the relief of finally sitting down without any obligations, but something about that chair made me feel calmer than I'd felt in a long time. I didn't reach for my phone, didn't feel the need to be doing anything. I just sat there, letting myself breathe and unwind. Pretty soon, sitting in that chair became my new ritual. Every evening, I'd grab a book or sometimes just sit and let the day melt away. It became my little quiet spot, a place where I could leave behind all the shoulds and to-dos and just be. I started to realize how little time I'd been spending like that, without an agenda, without productivity hanging over me. Somehow, this old, worn-out chair gave me permission to slow down in a way I hadn't let myself do for a long time. Then one weekend, I decided to fix it up a little. Nothing crazy, just some fabric cleaner, a few stitches on the arm where it was coming apart, and a soft throw to cover up the worst of the wear. Somehow, that made it even more special, like I was restoring something that had been waiting for a little care. As the weeks went by, that chair turned into my own personal refuge. I'd sit there in the morning with coffee, at night with tea, or just whenever I needed a moment to decompress. I think, in a weird way, it reminded me that not everything in life has to be shiny and new, that sometimes the things we value the most aren't the ones we planned for or chased after. They're the things we stumble upon, the quiet comforts we never knew we needed. This chair, this random old free to a good home chair, showed me that sometimes it's okay to slow down, to just sit still and let life happen without trying to control every piece of it. I realized how much I'd been missing out on those small, quiet moments because I was too busy running toward the next big thing. So here's my question. Has anyone else ever had something totally random or unexpected come into their life and change the way they look at things? It was supposed to be a quick stop. I ducked into a quiet bookstore after work, looking for a gift and maybe a few minutes of peace. The store was the kind of place that felt hidden in time, with its creaky floorboards, mismatched shelves, and the warm scent of old paper lingering in the air. As I browsed through the poetry section, my fingers trailed along the spines, lost in thought, when I heard a voice beside me. "That one's good," he said, gesturing to a worn, green book with faded gold lettering. I turned to see a guy around my age, wearing a jacket that looked like it had been through as many winters as he had. He had an open, friendly expression, and he was holding a stack of books that only someone truly passionate about reading would bother with. I picked up the book he'd pointed out, thumbing through the yellowed pages, and then I looked back up at him, intrigued. "I'll take your word for it," I said, laughing lightly, unsure what else to say. For some reason, we started talking about books at first, and then about life. He told me his name was Jack, and he had a dry, self-deprecating humor that made it impossible not to smile. We debated classic novels versus modern lit, the best opening lines, even whether poetry was too sentimental, which he argued passionately. There was something effortlessly comfortable about the conversation, and he had this way of pulling stories out of me I usually kept to myself. Eventually, we got so lost in our back and forth that I almost forgot why I'd come into the bookstore. It was only when the shopkeeper announced they were closing up that I snapped back to reality. We were standing by the door, laughing over some last-minute recommendations, when he paused and looked at me with a sort of quiet intensity. "There's this little cafe around the corner," he said almost shyly. "Want to grab a coffee?" It was impulsive, but I nodded, unable to resist the pull of whatever this connection was. The cafe was tiny, tucked away in an alley, with string lights draped from the ceiling and mismatched chairs crowded around small tables. The coffee was terrible, but the ambience was perfect, and we sat there for hours, the conversation flowing like we were old friends rediscovering each other after years apart. We met up again the following week, and soon it became our routine: a bookshop, a new cafe, or sometimes a late-night walk through the city. Every encounter felt like an escape, a shared world we built together piece by piece. Jack had this free-spiritedness about him, like he could see the beauty in ordinary things, and it rubbed off on me. Our days blurred into nights, and each time we met, I felt myself caring more, hoping he felt the same. One night, he surprised me by showing up with 2 tickets to a midnight movie marathon. It was a spontaneous move, but I'd come to expect the unexpected with Jack. We sat in that theater, sharing popcorn and nudging each other whenever something reminded us of one of our many inside jokes. Somewhere between the laughs and whispered comments, he reached for my hand, his fingers slipping between mine in the dark. It was such a small thing, but it felt monumental, like we were crossing into a new, uncharted territory. As the weeks passed, our unspoken bond grew stronger, and I realized just how deeply I'd let him into my life. He knew me in a way few people did. He knew the things I tried to keep hidden, the fears and insecurities I usually kept locked away. Jack had this way of seeing straight through me, and instead of turning away, he just accepted it all, as if he found beauty in the imperfections. But there was a shadow that lingered around him, a sense of something unresolved. He'd get quiet sometimes, retreating into himself, and when I tried to ask what was wrong, he'd give me a sad smile and say, "Just old ghosts." I didn't push. I figured he'd tell me when he was ready, and I didn't want to ruin the delicate balance we'd built by prying. Then one day he disappeared. He didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up at our usual spots. Days turned into weeks, and the silence gnawed at me. I found myself wandering through the places we'd been together, half expecting him to appear, to explain everything with that familiar grin of his. But he never did. I told myself it was just a fling, that he was a drifter, a free spirit who'd come into my life like a gust of wind and left just as quickly. But it was a lie. I'd fallen for him, deeply and irrevocably. and the emptiness he left behind was sharper than I'd ever imagined. Months went by, and I'd all but convinced myself to let him go, to lock the memories of him away as a beautiful, bittersweet chapter. But then, one rainy afternoon, I walked into that same bookstore on a whim, unable to resist the pull of nostalgia. And there he was, standing in the poetry aisle, looking almost exactly as I'd left him. He glanced up, his eyes widening in surprise, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the air thick with all the things we hadn't said. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked down, fumbling with the edge of a book he'd been holding. I had to leave. There were things I needed to figure out. I wanted to be angry, to demand why he'd left me without a word, but seeing him there, vulnerable and full of regret, softened the ache inside me. We ended up at our old cafe, sitting across from each other like we used to, our hands cradling cups of coffee that had long gone cold. He explained that he'd left because he didn't feel worthy of what we had, that he'd been haunted by mistakes from his past he hadn't told me about. "I wanted to be someone better," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't want to drag you down with me." I looked at him, feeling the weight of everything unsaid. He'd put up walls to protect me, not realizing that I'd have taken all of him, the good, the bad, the broken. I told him as much, and he smiled, a sad, grateful smile, reaching across the table to hold my hand. We sat there, letting the silence say what words couldn't, and I knew then that despite everything, he was still the person who'd shown me a world of unexpected beauty. Jack and I didn't pick up exactly where we left off. It wasn't that simple, but we began again, slowly, cautiously, piecing together the fragments of what we'd started, knowing this time we had to be honest, had to be vulnerable. And in that honesty, in that willingness to face the ghosts he'd been running from, we found something even stronger. Looking back, I realized that Jack was the chapter one didn't know I needed, the chance encounter that turned into a love story scarred and beautiful in equal measure. And as we walked out of that cafe, hand in hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a quiet, undeniable hope. Last week, I was driving back from a quick errand and took a detour through an old part of town I hadn't seen in years. I was stuck at a long stoplight when I noticed a small, run-down building on the corner. There was this half-faded sign above the door that read Larry's Video Rental in peeling, retro block letters. It was closed, boarded up, with weeds sprouting along the edges. But seeing it there, abandoned but still clinging to some faded glory, brought me back so fast it was like I'd been hit with a wave. Larry's Video used to be the spot for my family on Friday nights. When I was a kid, there was no better feeling than piling into the car, parents in the front, my brother and me in the back, our faces pressed against the window, just buzzing with anticipation. Every Friday after dinner, we'd head to Larry's to pick out a couple of movies and maybe a game for my brother and me. It was our weekly ritual, this simple thing, but looking back, it felt like a major family event. I could practically feel myself walking through those glass doors, the little bell above jingling. Right as we'd enter, I'd be hit with that mix of plastic cases, cheap carpet, and faint popcorn aroma. The walls were lined with rows upon rows of VHS tapes and DVDs in bright, colorful covers, each one a promise of adventure. It was overwhelming in the best way deciding what to rent. My brother and I would bolt to the kids section, which was this cozy little corner with a rainbow-colored rug and bean bags you could flop down on while you picked out the perfect movie. And then there was Larry himself, the owner. He knew every single movie in that store and could recommend something off the top of his head based on what you'd rented before. He'd ask how we liked last week's picks, and sometimes he'd save the new releases behind the counter just for us. If you returned a movie in good condition, he'd even give you a little Larry Star sticker that you could collect for a free rental after 10. At the time, I felt like he was doing me this huge favor, like I was one of his best customers. He probably did that for everyone, but it didn't matter. He made us feel special. I hadn't thought about any of this in years. But sitting there in my car, staring at that faded sign, I could almost see my dad wandering off to the action section, my mom browsing the classics, while my brother and I negotiated in whispers over our top choices. We'd finally settle on something, then race back to the front counter to see Larry and hand over our picks. The best part of the whole evening was yet to come. Heading home with a stack of tapes, the anticipation practically crackling in the air as we rode back. We'd set up a movie fort in the living room with blankets, bowls of popcorn, and every single light turned off to get that real theater vibe. Even as I remembered all this, sitting at that stoplight, I was floored by how something so small, just an old sign on a closed-down building, could bring back an entire era of my life. It wasn't even just about the movies. It was everything those nights represented. It was this rare time where all four of us were fully present, together, laughing and getting way too into the plot of whatever we'd picked, or teasing my dad for falling asleep halfway through. I don't think any of us realized it back then, but that routine was sacred. It was a guarantee, a promise that no matter how crazy the week got, Friday night was ours. The light finally changed, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I thought about all the little things we'd forget if it weren't for these chance moments that bring them back. We didn't need much back then, just a stack of rented tapes and a bowl of popcorn. That simplicity, that togetherness, felt like something rare and precious. When I got home, I called up my mom just to say hi, and we ended up laughing about those nights, about how she always got stuck rewinding the tapes before we returned them, and how my brother and I would beg for just one more movie. It felt good to know that those memories still meant something, that they were still there, tucked away like a favorite old movie reel, just waiting to be replayed. So, here's my question for you all. Have you ever stumbled on something totally random that unlocked a memory like that? Okay, deep breath, here's my little secret. Whenever I start to like someone, I make up these tests to see if they're worth crushing on. And I don't mean normal tests like seeing if they're kind to animals or if they remember my birthday. Oh no, that would be way too sensible. Instead, I put them through what I call my absurd compatibility tests, which are entirely imaginary, slightly ridiculous scenarios that exist only in my head, but I'm completely serious about them. Here's how it started. Back in college, I had a huge crush on a guy named Adam who I thought was absolute perfection. But every time I started to let myself daydream about him, I'd get this anxious, nagging feeling. How did I know he was as great as he seemed? Could he really handle the crazy, unpredictable world of me? So I came up with my first test, the lost passport test. Here's how it goes. We're on a trip somewhere, let's say Italy, and suddenly I lose my passport. I'm panicking, rifling through my backpack, totally at a loss. In my head, I'd run through how he'd react. Would he stay calm and help me search, making jokes to keep me from freaking out? Would he come up with a practical solution, like calling the embassy? Or would he just stand there, looking annoyed, and say something like, "I told you to keep it in a safer spot"? If he failed, then it was like, "Nope, sorry buddy, no more daydreams for you." Turns out, the imaginary Adam was not the compassionate type. I imagined him groaning, sighing heavily, and muttering about how I should have been more careful. The daydreams died a swift death. Since then, I've put every crush through their own personalized set of absurd compatibility tests. For instance, when I was into this guy named Josh, an overly enthusiastic gym rat with a heart of gold, I came up with the wilderness survival test. I'd picture us stranded in a random forest with no cell service, forced to survive together. In this scenario, Josh would start a fire, build a shelter, maybe even forage for berries. For some reason, I imagined him knowing all these wilderness survival tricks that he probably didn't know in real life. But hey, it was my imagination. But every time I ran the scenario in my head, he'd inevitably do something to fail the test, like refusing to eat the forage food because it didn't have enough protein, or trying to bench press a log instead of building a shelter. Fail. I can't tell you how many crushes I've ended because they failed an imaginary situation in my head. One guy couldn't handle the road trip disaster test, where we're stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic on a hot day with a broken AC. In my head, he got irritated and moody within 10 minutes, sulking while I tried to make the best of it. I don't know why, but in my mind, his grumpiness was unforgivable, and I found myself moving on by the end of that imaginary trip. He never knew what hit him, but he was mentally dumped before our second date. One of my favorite tests is the family game night test. In this scenario, I imagine bringing my crush home to meet my family, and we're all sitting around the table playing something like Pictionary or Monopoly. This isn't just a test of whether they get along with my family. It's all about how they handle the chaos. My family is big, loud, and notoriously competitive, and I've mentally broken up with several crushes over their imaginary reactions to a high-stakes game of Scrabble. Like if they can't laugh when my little brother accuses them of cheating, or if they don't playfully argue when my mom lays down a questionable word, then they're out. One guy actually passed this test with flying colors in my head. He managed to charm my imaginary mom, debate my dad over board game rules, and even let my little sister win. I was so into him after that, until he failed the next test. Yes, the sick day test. This one is my absolute favorite, probably because it's the closest thing to an actual comfort test. I imagine what would happen if I got horribly sick, like feverish, gross, can't move off the couch sick. In my head, I'd play out whether my crush would come over with soup, movies, and a cozy blanket, or if he'd just text me a quick "feel better soon" and leave me to wallow. My friends would probably call this unrealistic, but to me, if a guy can't handle my imaginary sick self, he doesn't deserve to see me at my best. I once broke up with a guy named Sam because I couldn't imagine him being the type to bring soup or even stay through a whole movie marathon. He just seemed like the type who'd stop by, feel awkward, and then leave after 20 minutes. And that's all it took. I was done. I think my quirkiest test so far was the pet sitting test. I'm actually a huge animal person, so this one's close to my heart. I'll imagine going out of town and asking my crush to watch my cat or dog for a few days. The imaginary version of them gets bonus points if they send me cute photos of my pet, play with them, and actually follow the feeding instructions I leave. I once dumped a crush named Jake because, in my head, he'd leave a window open and accidentally let my cat escape. Imaginary Jake spent hours searching the neighborhood while feeling horribly guilty. I decided right then and there that real-life Jake was too careless to be trusted with my heart or my hypothetical cat. The funny thing is, I think these tests make me feel like I have a bit of control over my feelings. When I'm into someone, I get so wrapped up in my imagination that it feels like the only way to stay grounded is to test them in all these absurd situations. The irony is none of these things would probably happen in real life, but somehow it makes me feel more prepared. I think it's my way of making sure they'd handle my weirdness and unpredictability before I risk putting myself out there. But here's the catch. Occasionally, someone passes all the tests, and that's when things get real. There was one guy, let's call him Leo, who aced every single test I could throw at him. He passed the lost passport test with calm reassurance, survived the road trip disaster test by singing along to bad 80s songs with me, and even nailed the family game night test by winning and graciously letting my little sister take the victory. By the time I mentally put him through the sick day test, and he showed up with my favorite soup and a random movie suggestion, I was utterly smitten. I convinced myself he was the one, and finally, I decided to actually ask him out. Spoiler alert, we went on one date, and it was average. Like painfully so. I don't know if I'd built him up so much in my head that the reality just couldn't compete, or if he just didn't have the same spark in person. But somehow, he was so much more amazing in the imaginary tests than he was sitting across from me at that little Italian restaurant. And I went home feeling oddly let down. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this, that no one will ever truly pass all my imaginary tests because, well, they're imaginary. It's still my way of having a little fun with my feelings and making crushes a bit more exciting, like I'm letting them into this secret, fictional world I've created. So, yeah, I'll probably keep putting people through my absurd compatibility scenarios. But maybe one day, someone will show up who doesn't just pass the tests in my head, but surprises me in real life too. Now that I've put this out there, please tell me I'm not the only one. Does anyone else have weird imaginary tests for their crushes? Or am I just out here putting people through invisible obstacle courses all by myself? So, this happened a few years ago when I had a massive crush on this girl, Anna. We'd been on a few casual coffee dates, but I wanted to do something special, you know? She was one of those effortlessly cool people who seemed like she'd just step out of an indie film. She loved art, had this bohemian vibe, and she was really into food, like the kind of person who could identify every ingredient in a sauce just by tasting it. And here I was, the guy whose regular meal prep was dumping cereal into a bowl. Despite my limited kitchen skills, I decided that I was going to cook her a fancy dinner. because apparently my brain thought it was a good idea to impress a foodie by pretending I was some sort of chef. In my defense, I'd recently watched a few cooking shows and thought, how hard could it be? After some intense Googling, I found what I thought was a relatively simple yet gourmet recipe: homemade pasta with a creamy mushroom and truffle sauce. It sounded fancy, but manageable. All I'd need was pasta flour, some mushrooms, and a bit of truffle oil. Plus, how hard could pasta be? It's just flour and eggs, right? The day of the date, I hit the grocery store and managed to find the essentials, including truffle oil, which for the record cost way more than I thought. By the time I got home, I was already running behind schedule, so I went full speed ahead. I set up my laptop in the kitchen and started following the recipe video like it was an intense game of Simon Says. Step 1, make pasta dough. Sounds easy enough. I pile some flour on the counter, crack a couple of eggs into the middle, and start mixing like I'd seen the chefs do. Within minutes, I realize this dough is sticking to everything: my hands, the counter, my shirt. Flour's getting everywhere, and I'm trying to stay calm while remembering that Anna is arriving in about an hour. I knead the dough furiously, but it feels more like I'm wrestling a wet beach towel than making pasta. After what feels like a lifetime, I get something that resembles a dough ball, wrap it up and set it aside to rest, hoping it somehow transforms into the silky, perfect dough I saw in the video. Step 2, the sauce. I pull out the mushrooms and start chopping, trying to go for a rustic look because neat knife skills are clearly out of my league. I throw them in the pan with some butter, and for a moment, I feel like I'm actually doing all right. The mushrooms start sizzling, the kitchen smells decent, and my confidence ticks up a notch. Then I get to the part of the recipe that calls for deglazing the pan with white wine. Easy enough, right? Except I forgot to actually buy the wine. Panicking, I look through my kitchen cabinets and find a dusty bottle of apple cider vinegar. Close enough, I think, so I pour a splash in, and instantly, this acrid, vinegary smell fills the kitchen. It's not remotely appetizing, but I try to stay positive, thinking maybe it'll mellow out once I add the cream. Spoiler, it didn't mellow out. By now, the clock is ticking, and I still have to roll out the pasta. I pull out the dough, dust it with flour, and try to flatten it with a rolling pin I borrowed from my neighbor. Thanks, Greg. But no matter how much I roll, the dough just snaps back like a rubber band. I'm sweating, rolling this thing with all my might, when I realize I've created something closer to a floury pancake than anything remotely pasta-like. In the middle of this chaos, my doorbell rings. I have flour smeared on my face, a pan that smells like a salad gone wrong, and dough fragments everywhere. I wipe my hands, take a deep breath, and open the door, trying to play it cool. Anna walks in, looking effortlessly chic, and I'm suddenly hyper-aware that my kitchen looks like the scene of a carb-fueled disaster. She smiles politely and says, "Wow, it smells interesting." I laugh nervously, mumble something about experimental cooking, and invite her to sit while I plate the pasta. In the end, what I served her was essentially doughy chunks in a sauce that tasted like mushroom-flavored vinegar. She was nice enough to take a couple of bites, but after that, she gently put down her fork, looked at me with this amused smile, and said, "You know, I think you were going for an al dente texture, but I might need a chainsaw to get through this." Mortified, I admitted the whole truth, that I had zero cooking skills and was just trying to impress her. Instead of laughing at me too much, she just shook her head, smiled, and said, "You know, you could have just taken me to a little cafe or something." We ended up laughing about it, ditching the pasta and ordering pizza. We spent the night eating greasy pepperoni slices and talking about everything from embarrassing stories to dreams and random bucket list items. By the end of the night, I realized that she was way more interested in the fact that I was willing to put myself out there than in my cooking skills, or lack thereof. We didn't end up dating long-term, but that night stuck with me. It taught me that sometimes trying to impress people with things you're not good at isn't necessary. Being yourself, messy, honest, and maybe even a little ridiculous, is what actually matters. And when I want to impress someone now, I leave the gourmet attempts to the professionals. It started with a package left on my doorstep, a brown paper parcel with my name scrawled on it in shaky, uneven handwriting. I hadn't ordered anything, and there was no return address, no indication of where it had come from. I looked up and down the street, but the only thing moving was the breeze rustling through the trees. For a moment, I considered leaving it there, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside the package was a small, battered leather notebook and a simple note on a torn piece of paper. For the next adventure, follow the first clue. I flipped open the notebook, and on the very first page, written in the same uneven handwriting, was a single sentence. Find the place where the city whispers and the stories hide in plain sight. My first reaction was confusion, then intrigue. I'd lived in the city for a while, but had never thought of it as a place where stories hid. Still, something about that phrase tugged at me. It was the kind of message that seemed like it had been left by someone who knew something I didn't. After work, I went out for a walk, notebook in hand, feeling a little ridiculous but also weirdly excited. Where the city whispers, I muttered, thinking about all the little nooks and crannies of the place. I wandered until I found myself near a street that was mostly abandoned, lined with buildings that hadn't seen new paint in decades. I paused by an old bookstore with a cracked wooden sign. The display was filled with dusty, mismatched books, some stacked haphazardly, as though they'd been tossed there in a hurry. It was the kind of place that felt forgotten, even by the city itself. I stepped inside, half convinced this would be the dead end of my adventure. But as soon as I walked in, a bell chimed, and an old man behind the counter looked up with a slow, knowing smile. Looking for something special? He asked, his voice low and warm. I'm not really sure, I said, holding up the notebook. I got this today. It's sort of leading me around the city, I think. He looked at the notebook and gave a small, approving nod. You found the right place, he murmured. The stories here tend to find the right people. He gestured to a narrow staircase at the back. Upstairs, there's a room with the city's secrets, if you're ready for them. I climbed the staircase, the creak of each step adding to the mystery. At the top was a small room filled with maps, old newspapers, and faded photographs of the city. The walls were covered with clippings, some recent, some decades old, each one a tiny fragment of someone's life or a strange event. A bank heist gone wrong, a lost ship found, a mysterious light over the lake. The whole room felt like it was a treasure chest, but instead of gold, it held the city's forgotten stories. One of the maps caught my eye. It had been marked with red circles in certain areas, and the handwriting matched the note from the notebook. There was something about those circles that felt like they were inviting me. Below the map was another note. Every place tells a different story. Begin with the one closest to the water. The city's waterfront was a maze of old docks, warehouses, and fishing boats, and each corner seemed to have its own tale to tell. The following evening, I went down there, clutching the notebook as if it were a guidebook. The place closest to the water with a red circle was an old boathouse that looked abandoned, the paint peeling and the windows clouded with dust. I pushed the door open, and it gave way with a loud groan. Inside was a strange assortment of items. Old fishing nets, lanterns, and a wall of photographs, each one showing a different person holding an ancient-looking compass. They seemed like snapshots from some kind of secret club, people staring into the camera with expressions ranging from pride to mischief. In the middle of the wall was a single blank space, and a little brass plaque beneath it that read, "For the one who follows the path." A thrill went through me. Whoever had started this strange journey had been here before, leaving these breadcrumbs, leading me along their path. But I was still missing a piece. There was nothing to connect me to the next clue. I scanned the room, my eyes landing on an old compass resting on a shelf near the door. It was dusty and scratched, but seemed well-loved, the kind of thing someone might keep with them for years. Beneath it was another note, folded into a neat triangle. If you're holding this, keep it close. It will guide you. I took the compass with me, slipping it into my pocket and leaving the boathouse, feeling as though I'd stepped into someone else's life. The city around me suddenly looked different, more mysterious, like it was hiding something just beneath the surface. Over the next week, I used the compass to explore each spot marked on the map. The red circles led me to places I'd never noticed before. A rooftop garden over a bakery, a statue with a small engraving of a poem, a mural hidden in a tunnel. At each place, I found another clue, another note, or sometimes just an object that felt significant in a way I couldn't explain. It was like following a thread that someone else had woven through the city, each stop revealing a small part of a story I didn't quite understand yet. Eventually, the compass led me to the final location on the map, an old train station on the edge of the city. The building was massive, its high ceilings and marble floors echoing with a kind of haunted grandeur. There was a single red circle on the map, marking the platform on the far end. As I walked toward it, I heard faint music, a piano playing something soft and haunting. I followed the sound until I saw an old piano in the corner, and next to it, a small leather-bound journal. The cover was worn, the edges frayed, but when I opened it, I found a letter addressed to the seeker. It was a farewell letter, written by someone who had once wandered the city the same way I had, following clues left by someone before them. Each person, the letter explained, was part of a chain, a line of strangers who'd left little pieces of themselves hidden in the city, hoping someone else would find them and continue the story. The last line read, "Now, it's your turn to leave something behind." I closed the journal, a strange mix of melancholy and excitement settling over me. I realized that this journey wasn't just about finding clues. It was about becoming a part of something bigger, a web of people who had all passed through the same places, connected by invisible threads. I left the journal by the piano, pulling the compass from my pocket and setting it down beside it. Someone else would find it someday, and maybe they'd follow the clues, discovering the secrets and the stories the city kept hidden. I left the train station feeling lighter, like I'd been entrusted with a precious gift, and that I'd done my part to pass it on. Walking home, I felt connected to the city in a way I hadn't before, like I knew it wasn't just a place on a map, but a living story, one I was now part of. And every so often, when I pass a quiet corner or see a piece of graffiti in an alley, I wonder if it's another clue, waiting for the next person to notice it and follow the path. So, I have to ask, have you ever stumbled into a mystery that changed the way you see your world? It was an ordinary Tuesday, the sort that usually just blends into every other weekday. I had some free time before a dinner reservation, so I decided to take a walk through a part of town I didn't know very well. I'd wandered down a few narrow alleys and side streets when I saw a narrow passageway marked by an old iron gate. Overgrown ivy and rusted metal spelled out a faded sign above it, the Forgotten Theater. I paused, feeling a strange pull. It looked like the kind of place you'd find in an old novel, a place with a history that clings to it like a shadow. The gate was unlocked, so, against my better judgment, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The passage led to a dim courtyard, with brick walls on all sides, all covered in ivy and the faint scent of mildew. At the far end was a doorway, arched and framed with heavy stone. Above it, a single word was painted in delicate gold letters: "Enter." I almost laughed. It was so theatrical, so surreal, but I figured I'd gone this far, so why not? Inside, I found myself in a small lobby that looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in decades. Dust motes drifted in the light from an old chandelier, which looked as though it might drop from the ceiling at any second. Heavy velvet curtains framed the entrance to what I assumed was the main theater. Their color faded to a dull wine red. But what caught my eye were the posters lining the walls. They showed scenes from old plays, elaborate costumes, strange props, and actors in poses so dramatic that it bordered on the ridiculous. At the bottom of each poster was a date, and they all seemed odd. Some were from the 1800s, others from decades I knew nothing about, and a few were from dates that hadn't happened yet. April 2nd, 2049, one read, with a picture of a woman staring straight out, her eyes meeting mine in a way that made my skin tingle. Just then, a voice behind me broke the silence. "Ah, the evening's first guest." I turned, startled, to find a man standing there, tall and thin with wild, salt and pepper hair and a tailcoat that looked straight out of another century. He had a theatrical air about him, like someone who'd performed his entire life and could never quite turn off the show. "Welcome to the Forgotten Theater," he said, giving a slight bow. "I am the keeper of this place, and you, my friend, are right on time." "Right on time for what?" I asked, still half convinced I was walking into an elaborate prank. For the show, of course, he replied, as if it were obvious. He beckoned me forward with a sweeping gesture, leading me through the curtains and into the main theater. The inside of the theater was both breathtaking and eerie. Rows upon rows of old wooden seats stretched out before a grand stage, framed by intricate, gilded carvings and velvet drapes. But what was strangest of all was that the theater was packed, not with people, but with mannequins. Dozens of them sat in the audience, dressed in all kinds of clothing from every era I could imagine, each one positioned as if waiting for the show to begin. Some had their hands folded politely in their laps, others had their heads tilted, and a few even held programs in their unmoving hands. "Please," the keeper said, gesturing to an empty seat in the front row, the only seat in the house not occupied by a mannequin. I hesitated, but his intense gaze and the overwhelming curiosity in me won out. I sat down, and as soon as I did, the lights dimmed, leaving only a soft glow illuminating the stage. The keeper stepped up, his face shadowed, but his voice ringing clear. "Tonight," he announced, "we present the lives you could have lived. A performance just for you." With a wave of his hand, the curtain lifted, and the show began. But it wasn't a typical performance with actors and a plot. Instead, scenes flickered across the stage, as if projected from somewhere beyond time itself. And each scene was a version of my life, but in a world just slightly different from my own. In one scene, I saw myself as a musician, standing on a stage with a guitar in my hand, my eyes closed, lost in a song I'd never played but somehow knew was mine. In another, I was an artist, my hands smeared with paint as I stood before a massive canvas, colors dripping in wild patterns. Each scene was vivid, pulsing with energy, filled with sights and sounds that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. Scene after scene unfolded, each one showing me a different path, a different me, a version of my life shaped by choices I'd never made. I saw myself as a teacher, standing in front of a classroom full of students, laughing at something one of them had said. I saw myself traveling the world, my backpack worn and dusty as I stared up at mountains, at ancient cities, at oceans stretching into infinity. And with each new scene, I felt something stir inside me, some mixture of joy and grief, of possibility and loss. Each life was beautiful in its own way, filled with people and places and dreams that felt real, like I could reach out and touch them if I only tried hard enough. When the final scene faded, leaving only darkness and silence on the stage, the keeper appeared again, stepping out of the shadows. He looked at me with a soft, knowing expression, as though he understood everything I was feeling. "You see," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "we all carry countless lives within us. Lives shaped by choices we never made, paths we never took. The forgotten theater lets us glimpse them, for just a moment, so that we remember the richness of what lies within." I nodded, still overwhelmed, unable to put into words the strange cocktail of emotions swirling inside me. The keeper smiled, his eyes twinkling with that same mix of mischief and kindness. "Before you go," he said, "take this." He handed me a small, silver key on a black ribbon, for when you wish to return. As I left the theater, the sounds of the city hit me like a wave, loud and jarring after the quiet, intimate world of the forgotten theater. The sky was darker now, stars just beginning to peek out from behind the clouds, and I found myself clutching the key tightly, afraid that if I let go, the entire experience would vanish like a dream. In the days that followed, I found myself revisiting those scenes in my mind, wondering about the lives I could have lived, the people I might have become. It didn't feel sad, though. Strangely, it felt liberating, as if I'd been given a gift. The reminder that there's so much more to us than the choices we've made. Sometimes, when I feel lost or uncertain, I take out the key, holding it like a secret, a reminder that within me lies a theater of possibilities, a whole audience of lives waiting to be explored. I haven't gone back to the forgotten theater yet, but one day, when I feel the pull again, I think I might. Because who knows what other lives, what other versions of myself are waiting there to be seen. Have you ever felt like there's another version of you somewhere, living a different life? A life you glimpse only in moments, like scenes from a show meant just for you? It was supposed to be a regular Thursday. I woke up, hit snooze 3 times, and finally dragged myself out of bed. But as soon as I stepped into the bathroom and looked in the mirror, something strange happened. There was a sudden flash, a cinematic whoosh, and a deep voice boomed out of nowhere. In a world where one person must conquer the chaos of the office and face the ultimate foe, their alarm clock. One man, one morning, no coffee. My jaw dropped. I looked around, trying to see if someone had snuck into my apartment with a sound system. But I was alone. I went back to brushing my teeth, thinking it was just some strange dream residue. But then I heard it again. Meet Alex, your average office worker, caught between ambition and apathy. The voice was like those dramatic movie trailers, with the kind of gravitas that made you sit up straight. And Alex was me. Suddenly, quick flashes played in my bathroom mirror like a movie trailer, showing me doing everyday things like hitting my alarm, stumbling through my morning routine, and chugging coffee. But each shot was edited for dramatic effect. Slow-motion shots of me glaring at my coffee mug, intense close-ups of my frustrated face in traffic, and that powerful voice narrating every single detail. I shook my head, splashed water on my face, and tried to laugh it off. But the trailer didn't stop. As I walked out the door, the world felt different. More intense, like I was moving in some high-stakes thriller. There was a sudden swell of epic music in the air, and I found myself strutting to my car like I was about to save the world. When I reached for the car door, the narrator kicked in again. With no time to waste, Alex rushes into a day filled with impossible challenges, ruthless deadlines, and the wrath of his boss. I almost laughed out loud, but the music was so intense it felt wrong to break character. I got into my car, turned on the radio, and was halfway to work when the trailer narration switched up. The voice softened, like it was introducing a new character. Meet Jenna, a relentless perfectionist, ambitious, driven, and maybe, just maybe, the unexpected partner in a journey she never saw coming. I glanced around, and sure enough, there was Jenna from marketing driving in the lane next to me. She had this serious, determined look, her fingers drumming on the steering wheel like she was strategizing her next move. Her car even had its own soundtrack, intense violin strings that followed her like an invisible aura. We made eye contact at a stoplight, and for a split second I saw her in a whole new light. It was like the trailer was casting her as my co-star in some grand, life-changing adventure. She raised an eyebrow, clearly noticing the weird, intense way I was staring, and I quickly looked away, feeling ridiculous. The trailer didn't let up once I got to work. Every single person I ran into had their own mini-trailer play the moment I looked at them. Kevin from IT was apparently the tech genius with a secret plan, his scenes flashing with shots of him typing furiously, surrounded by dramatic green lighting, his glasses catching the glare. Lisa from accounting had her own theme, the narration calling her the quiet enigma, harboring an unspeakable truth. And my boss? His trailer was pure villain material. As soon as I walked into his office, the trailer voice dropped to an ominous tone. The tyrant of the 9th floor, known for his ruthless demands and unrelenting pursuit of productivity, a man who would stop at nothing to meet the quarterly goals. The trailer shots of him were priceless. Dark shadows casting across his desk, his face half-lit like a classic movie villain, fingers steepled as he barked orders. For a second, I almost expected him to pull a lever and reveal a trapdoor under my feet. But the wildest part? No one else seemed to notice. People just went about their day while these elaborate, highly produced trailers played out around them. Each time I looked at someone, I'd get a peek into the movie version of their life, a version they probably had no idea existed. The receptionist was framed as a secret mastermind hiding in plain sight. My coworker Dan had a trailer about his life on the edge as the office prankster. And even the janitor had this gritty, noir-style narrative, the silent guardian who knew everyone's secrets. By lunchtime, I was exhausted from living in a non-stop movie marathon. I could barely handle the epic pace, the trailer's dramatic intensity, making even a trip to the break room feel like a pivotal scene. I leaned against the vending machine, trying to get a breather, when my own trailer voice chimed in again, low and tense. As the walls close in, Alex finds himself at a crossroads. Will he rise to the occasion or disappear in the sea of mediocrity? The vending machine whirred, spitting out my snack with an oddly intense clang. I couldn't tell if I was on the edge of an existential breakthrough or a breakdown. But the trailer wasn't done with me yet. When I went back to my desk, I noticed something. The trailer shifted from a general, epic voiceover to something almost personal, like it was narrating thoughts I hadn't even processed yet. Every life has a turning point, and today is Alex's. Will he keep drifting, or will he finally take a risk? Maybe even ask Jenna to join him? I felt my face heat up. The idea of asking Jenna out had been buried under years of maybe-laters and not right nows. But the trailer was digging it up like some emotional archaeologist. The scenes it showed me were unexpectedly vulnerable. Close-ups of me glancing at her across the break room. A montage of passing smiles. Quick exchanges in the hallway. It was like the trailer knew every half second of hesitation. Every glance. And it was calling me out. I tried to shake it off, but the narrator's voice kept pushing, relentless. Because sometimes the most epic journeys start with a single leap. By now, I was feeling like an actor trapped in his own life, urged by some unseen director to do something. So, finally, before I could overthink it, I walked over to Jenna's desk, heart pounding. "Hey, Jenna," I said, a little breathless. She looked up, surprised, and for a split second, I thought I could hear her soundtrack in the background, soft violins blending with a heartbeat-like thrum in my ears. "What's up?" she asked, her expression curious. I cleared my throat. "I was, wondering if you wanted to grab coffee sometime. Outside of work, I mean." She blinked, then smiled slowly. "Sure, that sounds nice." I could practically hear the trailer music swell, like the universe had just checked off a big plot point. But the voice didn't stop there. As we made plans, the trailer continued, softer now, with a hint of warmth. In a world of deadlines and routines, sometimes all it takes is one small risk to change the story. As I walked away, I felt like I was part of something bigger, like I was finally living up to the trailer version of my life. Maybe the narrator was right. Maybe this was my turning point. And just as I left work, feeling like I'd conquered something huge, the trailer voice came back one last time, fading into a hopeful whisper. Coming soon, the life Alex never saw coming. The world went quiet again, back to normal. But for the first time, it didn't feel normal at all. It felt like the beginning of something I'd been waiting for, like my life had just gotten its own opening credit. Finn and I had one of those friendships that felt like home. We met at work, thrown together on a project no one else wanted, and bonded over our mutual disdain for office small talk and terrible coffee. Soon, we were inseparable. Work buddies who became close friends, weekend adventure partners, even each other's occasional plus one to family events when dating wasn't going so well. Finn had this easygoing way about him, like life's storms barely fazed him, and I was the planner, the grounded one, forever double-checking everything. We balanced each other out. For years, he was my constant, my steady anchor in the chaos of life. And for years, it felt like that was all we'd ever be. But that changed the night we both went to Jamie's wedding. The whole thing was beautiful. Twinkling lights, a band that actually sounded good, way too much wine, and dancing that lasted until the early hours. Finn and I laughed all night, making up backstories for strangers at our table, passing little jokes across the room like we had our own private world. Somewhere around midnight, after more than a few drinks, I'd gone outside for some air, feeling the buzz of the night. I hadn't realized he'd followed me until he was right there, leaning against the wall, looking at me with that easy smile. We stood there in the quiet, watching the lights flicker in the garden. Then, out of nowhere, he asked, "Do you ever wonder if we missed our chance?" I felt my heart skip. I laughed it off at first, brushing it away with a joke, but he just kept looking at me, a hint of something serious in his eyes. "I mean it," he said. "Do you ever think that maybe, somewhere along the line, we could have been more?" I didn't know how to respond. I'd never let myself think of Finn that way. He was my best friend, my safe place. But the way he was looking at me then, with a softness I hadn't noticed before, I felt something stir in me. something I hadn't dared let myself feel. I didn't know if it was the wine or the magic of the night, but before I could stop myself, I took a step closer, brushing his arm. "Maybe," I said quietly. He looked down at me, surprised, but didn't pull away. And then, suddenly, his hand was on my cheek, and he was kissing me, slow, tentative, like he wasn't quite sure I'd let him. I kissed him back, feeling like I'd just stepped off a cliff, but also like I'd landed exactly where I was supposed to be. When we finally pulled away, he looked at me with a mixture of surprise and relief. "That was not what I expected," he said, laughing a little. "Me neither," I admitted, feeling my face heat up. We stood there in awkward silence, both of us unsure what to say. Eventually, we went back to the wedding, acting like everything was normal, but something had shifted. There was a new tension between us, something neither of us knew how to handle. The weeks that followed were strange. Finn and I tried to pretend like nothing had happened, but every time we were alone, the air between us felt charged, like we were both waiting for something to happen again. He'd brush my shoulder when he walked by, or our eyes would meet across the room, and suddenly, I couldn't breathe. Finally, one night we found ourselves at his apartment, watching a movie on his couch. We both had a long week, so it felt like a small relief, just hanging out like old times. But somewhere in the middle of the movie, his arm slipped around my shoulder, casual and familiar, yet it felt like electricity had shot through me. I didn't think. I just turned toward him, leaning in until our faces were only inches apart. He hesitated just for a second, and then he kissed me again. This time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. It felt like all the things we kept unsaid were spilling over. Years of friendship morphing into something else entirely. Afterward, we sat there in silence, both of us stunned. "So, what does this mean?" I asked, half laughing, half panicking. He looked at me, a little nervous but mostly calm, and shrugged. "I don't know, but maybe we don't have to figure it all out right now. Maybe we just go with it." And for a while, that worked. We didn't tell anyone, just kept it to ourselves, exploring this new side of us that felt both thrilling and terrifying. We'd text late at night, sneak glances at work, find excuses to be alone. But as much as I tried to ignore it, there was a part of me that was scared. What if this didn't work? What if we tried and it blew up, ruining everything we had? The fear lingered, growing until it was impossible to ignore. And one night, in the middle of one of our secret dates, it all came out. I told him I was terrified of losing him, that maybe we were better off as friends, that I couldn't stand the thought of losing the one constant in my life. He listened quietly, but I could see the hurt in his eyes. After a long silence, he looked down, fidgeting with the edge of his shirt. "I get it," he said, his voice soft. "I don't want to lose you either. But I don't want to ignore this either." We sat there, both of us caught between the comfort of what we knew and the risk of what we didn't. In the end, we agreed to take a step back, to give ourselves time to figure things out. It was painful going back to just friends, pretending we hadn't felt what we'd felt. But as much as it hurt, I knew it was the right choice. Weeks passed, and we tried to settle back into our old rhythm. But everything felt different. There was a tension in our conversations, a gap between us that we couldn't bridge. And no matter how hard we tried, it felt like we were pretending, like we were putting on a show for everyone else while inside. We both knew the truth. Finally, one evening, he called me, asking if I could meet him. When I got there, he looked serious, like he'd spent hours rehearsing what he was about to say. He took a deep breath, then looked at me, his eyes filled with something vulnerable, something real. "I can't keep pretending," he said. "I tried, but it's too hard. I miss you, not just as my friend, but as something more." He paused, searching my face. "Maybe it's a risk, but isn't that what life's about? Taking chances? Because I'd rather risk everything than go back to being just friends." Hearing him say it, seeing him there, open and raw, I felt something in me let go. All the fear, the worry, it melted away. I realized that I wanted the same thing, that I was ready to jump, no matter the risk. We kissed, slow and sure, and this time there was no hesitation. No wondering what it meant or where it was going. Just the feeling that we were exactly where we were supposed to be. Years later, when people ask us how we ended up together, we laugh. exchanging that secret glance we've perfected, the one that says, we both know we never had a chance of being just friends. All right, buckle up because I swear on my best jar of wildflower honey, this day happened just like I'm about to tell you. It started with a busted out radiator in my van. Bessie, she's called, because apparently 15 years of schlepping around hives and honey jars finally caught up with her. So, there I was stranded on a side street in Wicker Park, waiting for a tow truck. Normally, that'd be enough to turn the day into a dumpster fire, but sometimes the universe has a better sense of humor than me. I just finished explaining Bessie's condition to the tow guy on the phone when a flyer on the utility pole next to me caught my eye. It was so absurd I had to read it twice. Beekeeper wanted. Today, greenhouse on Ashland. There was no explanation, no contact info, just an address and a time. 1 p.m. I looked at my watch. 12:45. Fate? I don't know, but I had nothing better to do, and I figured worst case scenario, it's some hipster looking for Instagram content, and I get a free latte out of it. Now, walking into this greenhouse was like stepping into another world. Outside, Chicago was its usual November gray, cold, damp, and smelling faintly of diesel. Inside, though, was a warm, green paradise. The air smelled like basil and orange blossoms, and there was this soft hum of machinery, or maybe it was bees. A woman in overalls and red rain boots, who I swear looked like she just stepped out of a Wes Anderson film, walked up to me with zero hesitation. "You're here for the bees?" she asked, like this sort of thing happens every day. I don't know why I didn't laugh. Maybe it was the way she said it, like the bees were some sacred responsibility. I nodded. "Yeah, that's me, the bee guy." She clapped her hands like she'd just won the lottery and started pulling me deeper into the greenhouse, past rows of towering lemon trees and a table piled high with heirloom tomatoes. "We're in a bit of a jam," she said over her shoulder. "Our beekeeper bailed last minute, and we have this huge group coming in at 2. It's a honey tasting and apiary tour thing." I blinked. "Wait, you're expecting me to run a bee tour?" She turned and gave me a once-over, taking in my beekeeping boots, my flannel shirt, and the faint whiff of honey that I guess is just my permanent cologne. "You'll be perfect," she said, as if that answered everything. Now, I'm not one to back out of a challenge, especially not one involving bees, so I followed her to the back of the greenhouse. Sure enough, there was a row of hives, real beauties, painted in pastel colors with little floral designs. She handed me a veil and gloves and introduced me to the hive names: Queen Latifah, Sting Crosby, and my personal favorite, Beats. "We try to keep it fun," she said with a wink. By 2 p.m., I was standing in front of a crowd of about 20 people, a mix of parents with curious kids and urban yuppies who looked like they'd paid a premium to feel rustic for an afternoon. I started with my usual spiel: how bees communicate through dances, why they're vital for pollination, how a single hive can produce 60 pounds of honey a year. The kids loved the bee jokes. Why did the bee get married? Because he found his honey. And the adults kept asking thoughtful questions about colony collapse disorder and pesticide-free farming. And then the magic happened. As I was showing off one of the frames from Bee and Cess Hive, explaining how the workers capped the honeycomb, a shaft of sunlight broke through the greenhouse roof. It hit the honeycomb at just the right angle, and suddenly it was like the whole thing was glowing. The honey was this deep, golden amber, and you could see little flecks of pollen suspended inside. Everyone gasped, and I swear, even the bees seemed to pause for a moment, like they knew they were part of something special. Afterward, the woman in the rain boots, her name was Lila, by the way, asked if I'd be interested in partnering with the greenhouse for more events. I said yes, mostly because I'd already fallen in love with the place, but also because Lila had this infectious energy that made you want to believe in impossible things like magical honey tours on a random Tuesday. When I finally got home that night, after rescuing Bessie from the shop, I was still buzzing from the whole experience. It was one of those days where every little thing lined up so perfectly, you couldn't help but feel like the universe was winking at you. It made me think about how many of these moments we miss because we're too busy grumbling about broken down vans or checking our phones. So, yeah, that's my story. A busted radiator turned into an impromptu job interview, turned into a honey-lit moment of pure magic. Have you ever had a day that felt like it was straight out of a storybook or an old movie? All right, Here's one of those stories where a random, frustrating moment somehow spirals into a full-on life lesson. I didn't expect it to go this way, but here we are. So, it was a few weeks ago, and I was rushing to a job interview across town. I'd done all the usual prep, picked out my best, I'm totally qualified and professional outfit, printed my resume, ran through my answers in the mirror. I even left my apartment early, feeling weirdly prepared and ready to nail this thing. But of course, life loves to mess with you just when you're feeling smug. As soon as I stepped outside, the sky opened up like it had been holding back a month's worth of rain, just waiting for me to walk out the door. I dug through my bag, pulled out my trusty umbrella, and popped it open, ready to power walk through the downpour. Except this time, my trusty umbrella decided it had enough. About a minute into my trek, a huge gust of wind turned the whole thing inside out. I tried to fix it, but every time I managed to flip it back, the wind would just snap it inside out again, flapping around like some sort of pathetic, soggy bird. People on the street were openly staring, probably wondering if I was fighting a battle against an inanimate object and losing. At this point, I'm soaked, I'm late, and I'm wrestling with this ridiculous umbrella that was clearly not designed to withstand anything more than a light drizzle. I felt every ounce of my cool, calm, collected vibe dissolve as I stood there, staring up at the rain, just defeated. There was no way I was going to make it to the interview dry, put together, or even remotely prepared. And that's when I started laughing, like full-on belly laughing in the middle of the sidewalk with rain dripping down my face. I'd been so tightly wound about everything being perfect, about making the right impression, about being completely prepared for whatever life threw at me. And here I was completely at the mercy of a $5 umbrella in a thunderstorm. In that absurd moment, I realized just how silly it all was. My endless planning, my obsession with control, my constant worry over every little detail. Life is unpredictable. Umbrellas break, rainstorms happen, and honestly, I could either keep stressing about it or just roll with it. So I did something kind of liberating. I tossed the broken umbrella into the nearest trash can, held my bag close, and just walked. I didn't run, I didn't try to dodge puddles, I just let myself get soaked, head to toe, laughing the whole way. It was messy, ridiculous, but it was also one of the most freeing things I'd done in a long time. When I finally got to the office, drenched and disheveled, I was half expecting the receptionist to give me one look and call security. But instead, she just gave me a sympathetic smile and handed me a paper towel. I had to go in there looking like I just survived a monsoon, but surprisingly, it went well. We laughed about the storm, I explained the sad story of my umbrella, and instead of feeling embarrassed, I just felt human. The interview actually felt more real and genuine because I wasn't hiding behind this perfect version of myself. Since that day, I've tried to carry a little of that broken umbrella energy with me, not stressing as much over things I can't control, letting go of the need to have every single thing go my way. It's surprisingly refreshing to just let life do its thing and adapt instead of constantly fighting it. Anyway, enough about me. Has anyone else had one of those unexpected, ridiculous moments where things went totally off the rails but ended up teaching you something? The other day, I was on my way to meet a friend for lunch, and I realized something strange. I hadn't actually spoken to them in days, yet I knew exactly what they'd been up to. They'd posted about their morning coffee ritual, shared their frustration with the latest Netflix season, and even posted a photo of their dog wearing a tiny raincoat. By the time we met up, it felt like we'd already been talking all week. There was no big catching up moment. It was like we'd been living side by side, just in different locations, connected through this constant stream of updates. And that's when it hit me. We're living in a totally new reality, but we treat it like it's no big deal. We're so intertwined with our phones and our screens that real life and online life are completely blended. We can know the details of each other's days without ever talking face to face, like we're all living these parallel lives that overlap whenever we feel like it. Sometimes I think about how much life has changed in just the past couple of decades. We used to physically go places for everything, remember? Now so many of our interactions happen in these invisible spaces. We don't go to the bank. We pull out our phones and check our accounts. We don't hail a cab. We watch a tiny car icon move toward us on an app. The whole world is wrapped around us, digitized and ready to be summoned at a moment's notice. And yet none of us seems to be all that amazed by it. Take food delivery, for example. I open an app, scroll through menus from 5 different restaurants, and place my order without talking to a single person. I can even watch my food's entire journey on a map, like it's my own personal quest for lunch. A little red scooter icon shows me exactly where it's going and when it's arriving, like I'm some sort of all-seeing overseer of takeout. And when the delivery person arrives, they leave it at my door, snap a photo, and it's like, "Here, the package has been delivered, Your Highness." I barely even have to move. It's mind-blowing when you think about it. But most of the time, I'm just irritated if my food takes more than 20 minutes. Or how about the way we manage our friendships? I'll send a meme to someone, they'll reply with a laughing emoji, and that counts as catching up. It's like we've distilled entire relationships down to a few taps on a screen, and somehow, it works. We're staying close in the strangest ways. I've had long conversations with friends entirely through GIFs and emojis, and I genuinely feel like we're bonding. Sometimes, I'll realize I haven't seen someone in person for months, but I feel like we're in constant contact because we're always reacting to each other's stories or sending funny videos. It's like we're living in a parallel digital universe where staying in touch has been reinvented, but we all act like this is just the new normal. And then there's the fact that I have more conversations with my phone than I ever thought I would. I'll say, "Hey Siri, what's the weather?" And then 5 minutes later, set a reminder to buy dog food. And honestly, it's gotten to the point where I'll just talk to Siri about things out loud, sometimes adding a thank you at the end. I'm polite to my phone, like it's an actual assistant. I don't even think it's weird anymore. The other day, I actually found myself apologizing when it misunderstood me. "Oh, sorry, I meant tomorrow, not today." I mean, I'm treating this digital assistant like it has feelings. Even the way we experience the world has changed. I can get real-time updates on traffic, weather, and even restaurant wait times, all before I've left my house. If I want to know what's going on across the globe, I can check my phone and see live news, Twitter updates, and social media posts. I can look up restaurant reviews from people who ate there just hours ago. I don't just see my surroundings anymore. I see layers of information overlaid on everything, like I'm living in some kind of augmented reality. It's surreal, but we just nod and accept it like, yeah, that's normal. And the best part? We've all become completely reliant on these powers without a second thought. I'll walk into a room and have no idea why I'm there, but instead of retracing my steps, I just tell myself, if it's important, I'll remember it. I mean, we're relying on mental shortcuts that are basically giving up, but it feels fine because, hey, I can just set a reminder on my phone if it's really that important. It's like our devices are becoming part of our brains, filling in the gaps whenever we need them to. Then there's the whole concept of work. I remember when work was a place you went to, a physical building with walls and desks and people. Now work is just wherever my laptop is. I have friends who are taking work calls from the beach, sitting in coffee shops with their spreadsheets open, and attending meetings from their living rooms. I even know someone who did a presentation from their car once because they had to step out but didn't want to miss a big meeting. They put on their meeting voice and pretended they were in a conference room while sitting in the driver's seat. It's hilarious but also amazing. We're in this hyper-connected reality where work is just an idea floating around with us wherever we go. And our memories. I'll be looking for an old photo, and all I have to do is scroll back in my camera roll. I have thousands of photos stored there. Every trip, every meal, every random moment I thought was worth capturing. I can scroll back through years of my life in seconds. If someone asked me what I did last weekend, I'd probably check my phone to find out. We're recording our lives like they're documentaries, but we don't even watch them. We're just saving them like some sort of memory insurance policy. I don't need to remember what I did because my phone will remember it for me. The funniest part is that we're all walking around like none of this is strange. We act like it's totally normal to pay for coffee with a quick tap on our phones, to video chat with friends across the world at a moment's notice, to control the lights and temperature in our homes with a simple voice command. If someone from 50 years ago popped into our lives now, they'd probably assume we were all spies or superheroes. But here we are, just slightly annoyed if our Wi-Fi lags. I think the craziest part of all is that we don't even realize how extraordinary this is because it's crept into our lives so quietly. One day we're checking emails on our computers, and the next we're controlling our entire houses with our voices, trusting tiny devices with our memories, and ordering anything we need without even speaking to another human. We've gone full sci-fi without realizing it, and now it's just life. So here's my question. What's something in your life that feels totally futuristic, but that you've somehow come to think of as completely normal? One Friday night, I was lounging on my couch, wrapped in a blanket, scrolling mindlessly through streaming options. The week had left me drained, and all I wanted was a quiet night to reset. But then my phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing on the screen. I was about to ignore it, but something made me pick it up. Hello? There was a pause, and then a voice, soft, weathered, and a little uncertain. Is this Eleanor? I told him he had the wrong number, but he laughed softly, like he didn't mind the mistake at all. Well then, he said, maybe you're supposed to be Eleanor tonight. I chuckled, intrigued, and he went on, introducing himself as Max. He told me he was calling to remind Eleanor to meet him for coffee at a little spot called Bailey's on 3rd. It sounded like he was used to sharing stories with anyone who'd listen. And the next thing I knew, he was talking about the cafe, describing it in vivid detail. How it had an old jukebox in the corner, big booths with creaky leather seats, and a menu that hadn't changed in 50 years. Bailey's is a place where time just stops, he said, his voice warm and nostalgic. You should come see it sometime. It's worth a visit. We ended the call with a laugh, and after he hung up, I found myself smiling at the absurdity of the conversation. But something about that description stuck with me. The idea of a place where time stood still. Bailey's felt like it had etched itself into my mind, and I couldn't shake it. I'd never heard of it, but after a little online digging, I found it. Bailey's, a tiny coffee shop on the other side of town. Before I could overthink it, I grabbed my keys and headed out. When I walked in, it felt like I'd stepped back several decades. Bailey's was exactly as he'd described. Dim, cozy, with a jukebox humming a tune that sounded like it came straight from the 1960s. The place smelled of coffee and something sweet, and a handful of people sat scattered around, each absorbed in their own little world. I ordered a coffee and found a booth by the window, letting myself sink into the old leather seat. It was late, but the place had this steady warmth, like it was humming with a quiet, unhurried energy. People came and went, and I sat there, watching as the hours drifted by, feeling strangely at home in this place I'd never been before. Just as I was about to leave, a man, probably in his 70s, with wispy white hair and a wool coat that looked well-worn, sat down across from me without a word. For a moment, I thought he was confused, but he just grinned, his eyes bright with mischief. "So, you're Eleanor," he said, tilting his head as he looked me over, and I realized who he was. "Much, he left, surprised. I'm definitely not Eleanor, but you did invite me here." He chuckled and waved a dismissive hand. "Names are overrated. Everyone's got a story worth hearing, Eleanor or not." We fell into easy conversation, his voice smooth, lilting, as he shared bits and pieces of his life. He talked about places he'd been, people he'd loved and lost, moments that had stuck with him. He was a storyteller through and through, and he had this way of making even the smallest details sound like grand adventures. At some point, he pulled out a small, well-worn notebook from his coat pocket, its pages filled with faded handwriting. "I keep a log of the little things that make life beautiful," he said, running his fingers over the cover. "Memories, observations, funny little thoughts. A person can forget the best parts of their life if they're not careful." He handed it to me, letting me flip through. Every page was like a snapshot of a different moment. The smell of pine on a rainy morning. A stranger smiling on the subway. First snow of the season. Felt like the world holding its breath. It was a catalog of all the things that slip by unnoticed unless you're really looking. When I handed it back, he looked at me with a smile, his eyes sharp and bright. "Tell me, what's a memory that you keep in your back pocket? Something you wouldn't want to lose?" I thought for a moment, and then found myself talking about a road trip I'd taken years ago, driving aimlessly with a friend in the middle of nowhere, the two of us belting out lyrics to songs we barely knew, laughing until our faces hurt. I'd almost forgotten about it, but as I spoke, it all came flooding back, vivid and real, like I was right there again. He nodded, pleased. "That's the stuff," he said, tapping his notebook. "Those are the memories worth keeping." We talked until the cafe was nearly empty, the night pressing in from outside. As I finally got up to leave, he took out a small envelope and pressed it into my hand. "Open it when you need it," he said with a wink. "And when you find yourself around here again, drop by. You'll know where to find me." I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket and walked back to my car, the cafe's warmth still wrapped around me like a blanket. Driving home, I felt lighter, like I'd left something heavy behind. Bailey's and Max felt like secrets I'd stumbled onto, pieces of another world hidden just beneath the surface of my own. When I got home, I tucked the envelope in a drawer, not quite ready to open it. Weeks passed and life settled back into its usual rhythm. But every now and then, I'd catch myself thinking about that night, about Max and his stories, about the feel of that worn leather booth and the sound of the jukebox's quiet, endless hum. One night, after a particularly exhausting week, I remembered the envelope and decided it was time. Inside was a single, folded note. In Max's neat handwriting, it read, "Here's to the memory you haven't made yet. Seek it out. You'll know when you've found it." I didn't know what it meant, but I kept the note in my pocket like a lucky charm, letting it remind me to look up from the everyday chaos now and then, to keep my eyes open for the quiet magic that might be waiting just around the corner. And sometimes on my way home, I'd stop by Bailey's. I never saw Max again, but I'd sit in that booth, nursing a coffee, feeling the worn leather under me, watching the world outside drift by. There was something about that place, the way it held stories like an old friend. It reminded me to pay attention, to remember that life had moments that were worth carrying with me. Have you ever stumbled upon something unexpected that stayed with you, like a secret only you knew? Something that left you feeling a little less alone and a little more alive? Sometimes, when everything feels overwhelming, I find myself drifting back to the simple moments that somehow make the world feel right again. These memories are so small, almost quiet, but they hold this unexplainable calm, like a warm glow in the back of my mind. They're the moments that remind me of a different pace of life, where everything was simpler and somehow more whole. One of my favorites is this memory of a summer night on my grandma's porch. I was probably around 9 or 10. My family had spent the day at her house, helping her in the garden, playing with the neighborhood kids, eating way too much of her homemade bread. After dinner, just as the sky was turning dusky purple, I snuck back outside to sit on the porch swing. My grandma joined me, bringing out a little tin of cookies she'd saved from dessert, and we just sat there, the two of us swinging slowly, listening to the crickets and frogs sing their night song. She didn't say much, just patted my knee and shared her cookies with me. That quiet, the warmth of her next to me, the taste of those cookies with that soft summer breeze. It's like my heart made a little home in that moment. It's the memory I go back to whenever I need to feel safe. And then there was this one winter night with my best friend. We must have been about 14, and we'd gone out sledding with a group of friends. After everyone else had gone home, we stayed behind, sitting on top of the hill, just watching the snow fall around us. Everything was covered in this thick, pure white, and there was a strange, magical quiet that only comes with snow. We just sat there, leaning against each other, talking about our big plans for high school, for college, for traveling the world together someday. It was the kind of talk you have when you're young and everything feels possible, like there's no end to the things you'll see and do. That feeling of endless possibility, of friendship that feels like it can take on the whole world. I can still feel it whenever I think of that night, sitting there in the snow with no rush to go anywhere. Another one that always makes me smile is from back when I was about 7 or 8, sitting in the back seat of our family car during a road trip. We'd been driving for hours, my little brother fast asleep next to me, my parents talking quietly up front. It was just before sunrise, and I remember watching as the sky started to change, this gradual shift from dark to light. My dad noticed I was awake and pointed out at the horizon, saying, "Look, here comes the sun." We both watched as the sun slowly rose, casting everything in this golden, sleepy glow. I didn't say a word, just leaned my head against the window, feeling the warmth and watching the world wake up with us. I didn't realize it then, but it's one of those moments that stuck with me. The quiet magic of watching a new day begin, feeling safe and loved in that little car with my family. Then there's this memory of lazy Sundays at my aunt's farmhouse. She had a sprawling property with a small pond out back, and every so often, my family would spend the day there. My cousins and I would run around, exploring the woods, pretending the pond was some kind of enchanted lake. But my favorite part was always when we'd go inside for lunch. The house filled with the smell of my aunt's cooking. Homemade bread, thick stews, pies cooling on the counter. After we ate, we'd lie around in the living room, everyone too full and content to move. My aunt would pull out old photo albums, showing us pictures of our parents when they were young, telling us stories that made us laugh until we cried. Those Sundays felt timeless, like nothing could touch us there in that warm, cozy farmhouse, surrounded by family and stories and the smell of something baking. And then, of course, there's the memory of the firefly nights. My family had this tradition in the summertime where we'd go to this big, open field outside of town to catch fireflies. We'd pile into the car just as the sun was setting, driving with the windows down, singing along to whatever songs my parents put on. When we get to the field, it was always dark enough that the fireflies looked like tiny stars floating around us. I'd run around with a little jar, trying to catch as many as I could, laughing as they blinked and danced around me. My dad would help me gently release them at the end, his hand on my shoulder, telling me how the fireflies had jobs to do too. I remember looking up at the stars, feeling like the world was vast, but somehow right there with me in that moment. It's a memory that reminds me of how wonder and love can fit into even the smallest, simplest things. I also think back to those early Saturday mornings before my parents were awake. I'd creep downstairs, try not to make a sound, and curl up on the couch with a blanket and whatever cereal I could sneak out of the kitchen. I'd turn on the TV to watch cartoons, the volume as low as possible, so I wouldn't wake anyone up. There was something so cozy about it. Being the only one awake, the house so still and quiet, sunlight just starting to peek in through the windows. I'd sit there, eating my cereal, wrapped in my blanket, feeling like I had the whole world to myself. It was such a small thing, but it was my little ritual, a slice of pure, simple happiness that felt like it would last forever. Another memory that always brings a smile is from high school, one of those rare, perfect afternoons. A few friends and I had skipped the last period to head to a little pond on the edge of town. We spread out a blanket, brought a few snacks, and just lay there in the grass, talking about everything and nothing. The sun was warm, the sky that clear blue that only seems to happen in early autumn. One of my friends pulled out a ukulele and started playing, badly, but with so much heart that we all joined in, singing along and laughing, not caring who might hear us. I remember looking around at each of them, feeling this sense of belonging, like that little moment was a secret we'd all carry forever. And then there's this memory of baking with my grandma. Every holiday season, she'd let me help her make cookies, her tiny kitchen crowded with bowls and spoons and trays. She'd give me the important tasks, like stirring the batter or pressing cookie cutters into the dough, and she'd always let me lick the spoon when we were done. The whole kitchen would be filled with the smell of vanilla and sugar, the warmth of the oven. She'd hum Christmas songs under her breath, smiling every time I sneaked a taste of the dough. We'd sit together afterward, waiting for the cookies to bake, drinking tea, and talking about the holiday plans. It's a memory that feels like home, like the love and care she put into every little detail was something I could carry with me forever. I guess these memories are all just small things, fragments of moments that didn't seem like much at the time. But they're the ones I go back to, the little scenes that make me feel like everything's okay, like the world can still be quiet and beautiful if I look in the right places. They remind me that peace doesn't have to come from grand adventures or big accomplishments. It can be found in the smallest, simplest moments that stay warm in our hearts long after they've passed. So, what's that one memory that brings you peace whenever you think about it? You ever stop and think about how every little thing has shifted gears in the last 20 years? I'm not talking about the big stuff like, we carry tiny computers in our pockets and use them to argue with strangers about TV shows. I mean the quiet, sneaky changes. The stuff you don't notice until you're standing there, holding a fidget spinner your niece handed you, wondering what happened to marbles. I was walking to school the other day. Yes, I walked to work like it's 1953. Thank you very much, and noticed the neighbor kids waiting for the bus. A couple of them had AirPods and bobbing their heads, probably listening to something about Minecraft or whatever game lets you pretend to be a goat. I tried to imagine them standing there without any screens. Could they even do it? Just stand and look at clouds? When I was their age, we passed the time by daring each other to lick icy poles or playing a very questionable version of dodgeball that involved frozen acorns. Now they've got TikTok and 5G, and I can't decide if that's progress or just a creative way to avoid frostbite. The other day, I started my US history class with one of my famous trivia nuggets. Did you know, I said, standing in front of a sea of sleepy teenagers, that in the 18th century, England tried to tax windows? They thought people with a lot of windows were rich, so they slapped on a fee for every pane of glass. Folks bricked up their windows to save money, and that's why some old houses look like they had a visit from the world's angriest mason. Dead silence. One kid in the back raised his hand, not to ask about historical economics, but to say so. Were there memes about it back then? I stared at him, trying to decide if he was serious. But then I realized in his world, every big event gets a hashtag. Imagine the hashtags for the Boston Tea Party. Hashtag Yeet the Tea or hashtag No Taxation Without Representation. Paul Revere would have gone viral with a TikTok of his midnight ride, complete with EDM remixes. The British are coming, but make it auto-tuned. I don't mind though. Kids today have their own thing, just like we did. I grew up on Tamagotchis and Blockbuster nights. Those poor digital pets. How many of us let them starve because math homework got in the way? Now, kids have apps that remind them to drink water and hit their step goals. It's adorable in a way. They turn the stuff we used to take for granted, staying hydrated, going outside, in a quest with XP points. Oh, and have you noticed how rituals are changing? My best friend Mindy got married last summer, and instead of the classic bouquet toss, she did a TikTok dance with her bridesmaids. The guests formed a circle around them, phones out, and cheered as if we were watching the moon landing. It was sweet, but also surreal. I kept waiting for someone to shout, "Cut! Let's try that take again." Weddings used to be about unity candles and cake smashes. Now there are many productions with drones filming the bouquet from 6 angles. Speaking of weddings, I swear there's a generational gap in how we RSVP. My mom still insists on sending back the little pre-stamped card, complete with her favorite pen and perfect cursive. Meanwhile, I respond via text with 3 champagne emojis, and somehow both methods feel right. We live in a weird overlap of old and new, and I kind of love it. At the end of the day, though, some things stay the same. Teenagers still roll their eyes when you try to be cool. People still forget their umbrellas when it rains, even though Siri literally tells you the weather. And nothing beats the universal awkwardness of someone saying, "I love you" on the phone when you were only expecting a goodbye. That happened to me with my dentist receptionist last week. She said, "We'll see you at 3:30 bye," and my brain short-circuited. I blurted, "Love you too," and hung up so fast my hand hit the coffee mug on my desk. But isn't that the charm of it all? Life's one big mishmash of the old, the new, and the oops, I didn't mean to hit send. Maybe that's why I love teaching history. You get to zoom out and see how humans are always adapting, finding new ways to be weird and wonderful. Who knows what kids today will reminisce about in 30 years? Remember when we used to use emojis? Man, those were the days. Now it's all hologram reactions and AI mood rings. So, what's something in society that makes you smile? Something small, maybe a little moment of modern life that feels absurd or sweet or just delightfully human. Share it with me. I need some new material for when my trivia runs out. I met her at a summer festival, the kind where people dance under twinkling lights and the air smells like roasted almonds and cinnamon. She was standing by a food truck, laughing at something with a friend, and I caught myself staring before I even realized it. There was something magnetic about her, this glow that seemed to draw everyone in. I was never the type to approach someone out of nowhere, but something in me said that if I didn't, I'd regret it. So I walked up, made a joke about the absurdly long line for churros, and somehow we clicked instantly. Her name was Elena, and she had this way of talking that made every word feel like an invitation to something more. We spent that night exploring the festival together, weaving through stalls, sharing ridiculous stories. She dared me to try fried crickets, and I dared her to sing along when a street musician started playing a Beatles song. She didn't hesitate, belting out the lyrics, her voice off-key, but filled with so much joy that people around us started clapping along. When the night ended, we exchanged numbers with a laugh, like it was the most natural thing in the world. As she walked away, she turned back, grinning, and shouted, "See you in my dreams." It was such a cheesy line, but somehow, coming from her, it felt like a promise. Our first official date happened a week later at an old bookstore she loved. She was a serious reader, and watching her browse the aisles, I felt like I was seeing a side of her no one else did. She picked out a book for me, a tattered paperback with a handwritten dedication in the front, and said, "This will change you." I wasn't sure what she meant by that, but I took the book and let her lead me out of the shop. We spent the rest of the day together, and then the next, and soon we were spending almost every weekend exploring her favorite places in the city: an old jazz bar, a hidden rooftop garden, a tiny family-owned bakery with the best pastries I'd ever tasted. She knew all these little secrets, and with each place, I felt like she was letting me into her world, piece by piece. Elena had this spontaneity, this zest for life that made everything feel like an adventure. She'd call me at random times, saying things like, "Get ready, we're going on a road trip," or "Pack a picnic, I've got a surprise spot for us." Once, she made me climb up this hill in the middle of nowhere just to watch the sunrise. I complained the whole way up, but when we reached the top and saw the lights spreading over the valley, she just looked at me and said, "Worth it, right?" I couldn't argue. Being with her made me see the world differently, like there was beauty in every little thing if you were willing to look for it. But as perfect as it all felt, I started noticing little signs that something was off. She'd sometimes go quiet, looking away with this far-off expression, and when I asked what was wrong, she'd brush it off with a smile, changing the subject or making a joke. One night, as we lay on her couch, watching an old movie, she suddenly sat up and said, "Promise me something." She turned to me, her eyes intense, her hand gripping mine. "Promise me you won't expect me to stay forever." I laughed, thinking she was joking, but she didn't smile. "I mean it," she said softly. "Just promise." I nodded, not really understanding, but the way she looked at me made me feel like I had to agree. After that, everything felt the same, but also different, like there was an invisible clock ticking away somewhere in the background. I started treasuring every moment with her, holding on to each laugh, each kiss, as if it could be the last. She'd talk about places she wanted to visit, about learning new languages, meeting new people, and I could feel her spirit tugging at the edges, always wanting more. She'd say things like, "Can you imagine just dropping everything and moving to Paris?" Or, "What if we just lived out of a van and traveled the world?" She'd laugh when she said it, but I knew there was a part of her that wasn't joking, a part of her that was already somewhere else. Then, one evening, she invited me over for dinner and made all my favorite dishes, filling the table with candles, the kind of romantic setup that felt like the start of something big. We laughed, drank wine, danced in her tiny living room, and I could almost convince myself that the strange moment on the couch had just been a fleeting thing. But as we sat down after dinner, she took my hand, her fingers trembling, and told me she was leaving. Not for a job or another relationship, just leaving. She wanted to see the world, to travel, to find something that she couldn't name but felt was out there, waiting for her. "I thought I could stay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought I could be happy here with you in one place. But there's this part of me that needs to go, and if I don't, I'll always wonder." I wanted to tell her that we could make it work, that I could travel with her, or wait for her to come back, but she shook her head. "You have roots," she said softly, "and I don't think I ever will." We spent that night together, holding each other in silence, neither of us wanting to let go. The next morning, she was gone. She left a note on my nightstand, a simple thank you for everything with a little sketch of a sunflower, something she used to draw on napkins and scraps of paper. It was her way of saying goodbye, but it left me feeling like she'd taken a piece of me with her. I tried to move on, to tell myself that I'd been lucky to have those months with her, to experience that kind of love. But every time I saw something that reminded me of her, a battered old bookstore, a street musician, the sunrise over a hill, I'd feel this pang, this emptiness that I couldn't shake. I kept her book, the one she'd picked out for me, and sometimes I'd read the dedication over and over, wondering if that was her way of saying goodbye from the start. Years have passed, and I still find myself looking for her in crowded places, half expecting to see her laughing by a food truck or wandering through a bookstore, some new place that she's made her own. I still hear her voice sometimes in a song or a line from a movie, telling me to keep exploring, to find joy in the little things. She taught me that love doesn't always mean holding on, that sometimes it's about letting someone go, letting them find their way, even if it leaves you standing alone, wondering what might have. It started with a company I'd never heard of, a tech startup with a flashy website and an over-the-top mission statement, redefining the future of connectivity. Honestly, the name and mission sounded like a lot of corporate fluff, but the job itself? Perfect match. A mix of what I was already good at and what I wanted to be doing more of. So I figured, why not give it a shot? The worst they could say was no. The first interview was, well, everything you'd expect from a small, scrappy startup trying to look like a billion-dollar company. The recruiter was young, maybe a few years out of college, and practically radiated enthusiasm over the phone. She laughed a little too loudly at my jokes, complimented my experience as if I'd invented the concept of teamwork, and asked a few basic questions. After about 10 minutes, she told me I'd moved on to the next round. It's a pretty rigorous process, she said, her voice a mix of excitement and warning. But you're going to do great. I hung up feeling oddly pumped. Something about her confidence felt contagious. 2 days later, I had my second interview, this time with the department head, a guy named Ben who looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. We chatted over Zoom, with him speaking at a pace that suggested he had 3 more meetings lined up back to back. I could tell he was the ideas guy, the kind of person who throws out big concepts with a casual snap of his fingers. He asked me questions that sounded pulled from a CEO's playbook, like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And what's the one thing that drives you? I gave him my best answers, trying to seem inspired and ambitious without going overboard. He nodded along, made some vague, approving noises, and ended with a, "You'll be hearing from us soon." I assumed that was a good sign. Sure enough, the recruiter emailed me the next morning. "You're moving to round 3, she wrote, with an exclamation point that felt almost like a hug. She added that the 3rd round was an important part of the process because I'd be presenting a project proposal to their team, something that showcased my problem-solving skills. I never had to prepare a proposal for an interview before, but I was game. They wanted to see what I could do. I'd show them. I spent the next few nights crafting a proposal, complete with slides and visuals, like I was pitching a $1 million idea to a panel of investors. I was practically vibrating with energy by the time the interview came around, ready to blow them away with my hard work. The panel this time was 3 people. The head of product, someone from marketing, and Ben, the department head who now seemed less disheveled but equally uninterested. They sat back while I presented, nodding along as I walked them through my ideas, occasionally jotting down notes. But just as I was wrapping up, Ben interrupted with a question that threw me off completely. "How would you handle this if you were given no budget?" he asked, his tone bordering on skeptical. I'd built my entire proposal around the idea that I'd have resources to work with. I scrambled, trying to answer, but it was like a brick wall. The vibe in the room turned cold, and by the end of it, they looked as bored as I felt embarrassed. I walked away from that interview feeling like I'd tanked it. But then, like clockwork, the recruiter called me the next day. "They loved your enthusiasm," she chirped. "You're moving on to the next round." She sounded genuinely thrilled, which threw me. Did they really think I was still a good fit after I'd stumbled through that Q&A? I didn't know whether to be relieved or suspicious. Round 4 was with the CTO, a graying man with intense eyes who gave off major. I built this company from my garage energy. He launched into an impromptu lecture about the future of technology, which I mostly nodded along to, pretending I understood every tech buzzword he dropped. Halfway through, he threw out the question, "Why us?" in this tone that felt almost accusatory, as if I'd shown up to his house uninvited. I felt like I was pleading my case, trying to prove I really did want to work there, that I was willing to be part of their vision. By the end of the call, I wasn't even sure I wanted the job anymore, but I'd already invested so much time that I couldn't walk away now. A few days later, I got the email. They wanted me back for a final round, yes, a 5th interview. By this point, I was exhausted, but I figured one last round would seal the deal. The recruiter assured me this was the last step, just a casual chat with a few senior members of the team to see if I'd be a cultural fit. I prepared some light, friendly answers and logged onto the call with what energy I had left. But instead of a friendly chat, I was met with what felt like a surprise interrogation. One of the managers, a guy named Scott, launched into questions about hypothetical scenarios that sounded straight out of a management training manual. What would you do if two team members had conflicting priorities? How would you respond if a project suddenly got moved up by a month? By the end, I was drained, stumbling through answers, feeling more like a lab rat than a job candidate. They nodded, said their goodbyes, and the screen went black. I closed my laptop and just sat there, feeling a strange mix of relief and resentment. They dragged me through a gauntlet and left me wondering if any of it had been real. I waited a week, telling myself they were just finalizing details. I waited another week, my optimism dwindling. Finally, I sent a follow-up email. No response. I tried again a few days later, still nothing. I'd spent hours interviewing, putting together proposals, answering absurd questions, and now nothing. Just silence. It felt like I'd been toyed with, led through this elaborate game for their own amusement. I started thinking back to each interaction, each round, and wondered if they'd ever really intended to hire anyone, or if I'd just been one of many, passed through the process to fulfill some unspoken company ritual. I found out later from a friend in recruiting that some startups, especially ambitious ones like this, use the interview process as a form of marketing. By pulling in candidates, they create buzz, make it look like they're growing rapidly and hiring up. They get candidates to share fresh ideas, test out new approaches, sometimes even steal the best concepts without a single offer. For them, interviews are less about filling roles and more about collecting free insight. I'd been a part of their strategy, a pawn in their game, and they didn't owe me a thing. It took a while to shake the bitterness. For weeks, every time I thought about all the time I'd wasted on them, I'd feel my face heat up. I started telling friends, swapping ghosting stories, and found out I wasn't alone. There were others, just as frustrated, some with stories even worse than mine. We joked about writing a candidate manifesto, demanding respect and accountability. If I had the power, I'd make it a rule. No more than 3 interview rounds. No ghosting allowed, period. If they dragged you through more than 3 rounds, they'd owe you compensation for your time, or at least a detailed explanation if they dropped you. These days, I treat interviews with a dose of skepticism. I ask more questions, take my time deciding if they're worth my time. I'll never know if that company ever filled the role, or if they just kept stringing candidates along to test out new ideas. But I know one thing for sure. I'm done jumping through hoops for anyone who can't see the value in treating people with respect. And maybe, just maybe, the next time they're hiring, they'll realize that some of us are onto them. So there I was, standing in the checkout line at the hardware store, clutching a bag of screws that I probably didn't even need because, let's face it, I'm not building a space shuttle. My eyes wandered over to the gum display. You know, the one with 57 flavors of mint that somehow all taste like sugar-coated plastic. And it hit me, I haven't bought gum from a store in like 5 years. Because why would I? I've got an online cart for everything from camping gear to eco-friendly laundry detergent pods that smell like Himalayan rain, whatever that is. The last time I actually needed screws, I ordered them online at midnight, sitting on my couch with a blanket over my knees like an elderly raccoon hoarding snacks. I blame the bears. Hear me out. When your job involves wrangling everything from lost tourists to actual wildlife, your brain starts to crave efficiency. I'm a park ranger, which means my day ranges from teaching a group of second graders why they shouldn't feed marshmallows to raccoons. They love marshmallows, to chasing down a black bear who's decided that trash cans are a buffet. There's no time for leisurely browsing through aisles of hardware when there's a 400-pound furball who I've affectionately named Dumpster Dan, ripping apart someone's picnic basket. Dan, by the way, is what I like to call a personality. He's not aggressive, but he's definitely persistent. Last month, he managed to climb into the bed of a pickup truck and tear open a cooler full of bratwurst, which he ate with the dignity of a king. I had to shoo him away with a horn, and the look he gave me, I swear he was judging my life choices. Like, lady, I'm eating better than you are. Go have a salad. Anyway, When you spend your days chasing animals with the emotional depth of toddlers, the idea of waiting in line for screws seems absurd. But back to my revelation about gum. It's not just gum, it's everything. We're living in this weird age where the most random things have become completely normal, and nobody even questions it. I'll give you an example. Last week, I was hiking out near Bear Creek, and I saw a guy standing on a rock with a drone. He was wearing those wraparound sunglasses that make everyone look like an extra in a 90s action movie, and he was live streaming the sunrise. To who? No idea. Probably his mom and some bots from Russia. But the craziest part was that I didn't think it was crazy. I just nodded and kept walking because, sure, why wouldn't he be live streaming? It's 2024, apparently. The only thing we don't do on camera anymore is sleep. I feel like I should be more bothered by this. But honestly, I think it's kind of amazing. Like, take memes, for example. Remember when you'd get an email from your uncle with a grainy picture of a cat in sunglasses, and that was the funniest thing ever? Now, memes are practically their own language. Last week, my coworker texted me a picture of a raccoon with the caption, "When the park ranger tells me to leave the trash cans alone." I laughed so hard I snorted coffee out of my nose. Memes have replaced serious conversations in my life, and I'm not even mad about it. Who needs to check in with friends when you can send them a picture of Kermit the Frog looking existentially sad? Same vibe, less effort. Oh, and don't even get me started on delivery services. You ever order something just to see how fast it can get to your house? The other day, I ran out of oat milk, and instead of going to the store like a normal person, I ordered a single carton online. It arrived in 3 hours. I don't know who decided oat milk needed to move at the speed of light, but I'm not complaining. I used to think this was lazy, but now I've embraced it. Life is chaotic enough without standing in line behind a guy buying 27 frozen pizzas because they're on sale. And honestly, as someone who spends most of her time in nature, there's something weirdly comforting about these little quirks of modern life. I love the forest, don't get me wrong. There's nothing like the sound of wind in the trees or the sight of a herd of elk grazing at sunset. But it's nice to know that when I'm done battling the elements, I can collapse on my couch and scroll through TikToks of people pretending to be medieval peasants. Balance, right? Sometimes I wonder if people in the future will look back at us and think we were absolutely insane. Like, they had machines that could deliver coffee in under 10 minutes, but they still had to pay for Wi-Fi on airplanes? The contradictions are part of the charm, I think. We're living in this bizarre mashup of convenience and chaos, and it's somehow working. So here's my question. What little thing in today's world makes you smile, even if it's a bit quirky? Maybe it's something weird like the way people clap when a plane lands, or something simple like finding a perfectly ripe avocado at the grocery store. Whatever it is, I want to hear about it. Let's celebrate the strange, wonderful details that make life in the 2020s so uniquely ridiculous. The day started out like any other. I dragged myself out of bed, still half asleep, and grumbled to myself about how much I hated mornings. But as I muttered those words, something strange happened. They didn't just stay in my head. They hung in the air, ghostly and translucent, floating there like a delicate fog. "Hate mornings," they said, the letters forming exactly the way I'd spoken them. I froze, watching the words slowly fade into a misty outline before disappearing altogether. Okay, weird. I chalked it up to being too tired, maybe still dreaming. I rubbed my eyes, took a deep breath, and muttered, "Wake up, you're just seeing things." Again, the words appeared right there in front of me, soft and shimmery. "Wake up, you're just seeing things." This time, I couldn't deny it. My words were real, visible, hanging in the air. I waved my hand through them, and they wobbled before fading out again. Fully awake now, I decided to test it out. "Hello, world," I said, feeling ridiculous, and sure enough, "Hello, world," popped up in shimmering letters. They lingered a moment, twirling and shifting like smoke, then slowly dissolved. I couldn't help but grin. This was going to be interesting. Getting ready, I found myself talking more than usual, just to watch the words appear and float away. "Guess I'll try the blue shirt today," I mused, and right above the shirt, the words spelled themselves out, wrapping around it in a cloud before fading. Everything I said, even little things, popped up for a few seconds, hanging in the air like visible whispers. It was strangely satisfying. But on my way to work, things took a turn. I was standing at a crosswalk, lost in thought, when I accidentally mumbled, "I wish this light would just hurry up." The words shot forward in front of me, bright and bold. And before I could process what was happening, the words floated over to the stoplight and stayed there glowing. And suddenly, the light changed. I blinked, wondering if I'd imagined it. But when the same thing happened at the next crosswalk, I realized that these weren't just floating words anymore. They were commands. My words were affecting the world around me. The light wasn't ready to change, but my impatience had made it obey. This was new territory. I started testing it out cautiously. When I got to the office, I muttered, "I hope there's no line for coffee." The words slipped away toward the coffee counter, shimmering. And just like that, the line vanished as people seemed to scatter and disperse, leaving me first in line. I could feel the power thrumming under my skin. The day went on like this. "Please let there be no emails," I whispered before checking my inbox. And when I looked, it was completely empty. This had never happened, and the freedom felt like a gift. It wasn't long before I started to get creative. "I hope this report reviews itself." The words floated to my computer, and the document practically scrolled itself. Like the words, it seeped into the screen, editing and tidying things up without me even touching the keyboard. The whole thing was intoxicating. Everywhere I went, I'd throw out casual wishes or requests, watching them float, dissolve, and then work. I had the power of suggestion in the most literal sense, and it seemed like the universe was listening, waiting on every word. But as the day went on, I noticed something unexpected. It was subtle at first, an offhand comment here, a random thought there. Each word I spoke left a faint, translucent echo in the air, even when I didn't intend it to. By lunchtime, my desk was cluttered with lingering phrases. "Need coffee," "skip this meeting," "another Monday." They didn't disappear like before. Instead, they stuck around, piling up like stray notes. By late afternoon, my entire office was a web of these floating phrases. Everywhere I looked, there were traces of thoughts and wishes and complaints, as if they'd accumulated over the course of the day, ghostly and persistent. As I glanced around, I realized something disturbing. Everyone else's words were here too. The words left by my coworkers hovered near their desks in clusters and clumps. Over my cubicle wall, I saw a jumble of "need to get out of here" and "I can't stand this meeting" above my boss's desk. It was surreal, like being inside everyone's private thoughts, their gripes and dreams, just floating out in the open. I took a step back, watching the fragments float around me. Some words drifted toward me, pieces of other people's lives that they might never have said out loud if they knew someone would see. But here they were in plain sight. And then my curiosity got the better of me. I leaned over to my coworker David's desk, glancing at the faint phrases scattered around him. Why doesn't anyone listen to me? I hope my idea gets noticed today. The sadness in his words hung there, clear as day, shimmering with unspoken hopes and fears. I felt a pang of guilt. I'd never known he felt that way, and now, without his permission, I knew more about him than I ever would have guessed. The same happened with others. Beneath the usual office banter, there were fragments of raw honesty, hopes, frustrations. As the sun set, the words became thicker, cluttering the air, filling the office with the weight of everything unsaid. By the time I left work, I was shaken. My once charming ability to shape the world with words felt more complicated. Words weren't just floating whispers. They were snapshots of every private thought and feeling, lingering and visible for anyone who cared to look. I could see people's insecurities, their dreams, their anger, and suddenly I felt the same vulnerability myself. My own phrases, the ones I'd so casually thrown out, trailed behind me on the walk home. At first, I tried brushing them away. I waved my hands through the floating words like I was clearing smoke, but the more I tried to erase them, the more they seemed to multiply. Feeling overwhelmed. Wish I hadn't seen all that. Maybe this power isn't worth it. As I walked, I passed strangers on the street, each leaving traces of their own. Some phrases drifted softly from people's mouths like murmured wishes. Others were sharp, jagged fragments. I don't know what I'm doing. Just hold it together. I wish someone understood me. I could see it all. The honesty people kept hidden, the pain, the joy, the unguarded bits of humanity in each of us. By the time I got home, I felt like I'd carried 100 lifetimes with me. I had stumbled into everyone's hidden lives, and now, even my own thoughts floated beside me, unfiltered and fragile, like delicate glass. For the first time, I felt the true weight of words, not as a force to control or wish away, but as a part of us that shapes our world in ways we don't even realize. That night, lying in bed, I whispered carefully, deliberately, "I hope tomorrow is quieter." The words appeared, soft and pale, hanging above me for a few moments, then slowly faded. And as I drifted asleep, I hoped they would take all the other words with them. Okay, so here's the thing. I'm not saying my new nightly habit of watching shady videos about cursed antiques is what triggered this whole mess. But let's not pretend it didn't paint a big, neon mess with me sign over my entire existence. Picture this. Last night, after one too many documentaries about haunted clocks and possessed Victorian hairbrushes, I decided to reward my own questionable choices by walking down to the corner shop for some late-night snacks. I needed Doritos and ice cream. Don't judge. Anyway, I step outside and the city is doing its usual San Francisco thing. Fog thicker than my student loan anxiety, streetlights flickering just enough to feel ominous, and this random dude skateboarding down the sidewalk while carrying a full gallon of milk. Totally normal. But then I see this thing on the curb. It's like a shoebox, except not a shoebox because it's glowing faintly, which I figure is either cool or radioactive. It's got these weird markings on it, like runes, or maybe just someone's failed attempt at cursive. And for reasons that will probably puzzle historians someday, I decide to pick it up. Like straight up scooped it into my arms like it was a kitten in need of rescue. What's the worst that could happen? I thought. Famous last words. The second I touch it, this soft humming noise starts up like the shoebox is purring. My brain goes, hey, maybe it's some kind of high-tech gadget, but then my inner gremlin is like, or maybe it's an ancient artifact that will curse you and your future offspring. But, curiosity. So I open it. Inside, a single pen. Just a normal-looking ballpoint pen. Except, plot twist, it's got this teeny, glowing gem embedded in the side, which is both tacky and intriguing. There's also a note, handwritten on what looks like parchment, because of course there is. It reads, "Write with intention." That's it. No instructions, no context, no customer service hotline. Just 3 cryptic words and a ballpoint pen that may or may not be sentient. So, naturally I do the only logical thing. I bring it home, sit at my tiny desk that's half covered in coffee stains and half covered in half-finished sketches, and I start doodling. At first, I just draw a cat because I'm a creature of habit, and here's where it gets weird. The cat comes to life. Not like, oh wow, it looks so realistic. No, the literal drawing of a cat wiggles off the page, stretches like it just woke up from a nap, and starts prowling around my apartment like it pays rent. Now, I live in a studio, which is code for 1 room and a bathroom. I have no idea what to do with this sketch cat. Do I feed it? Pet it? Call animal control? While I'm panicking, it jumps on my couch and knocks over my half-eaten bag of chips. At this point, I'm too stunned to even be mad. And because I clearly don't learn from my mistakes, I decide to test the pen again. This time I draw a little coffee mug. Boom! Now I have an actual mug of coffee steaming on my desk, which would have been great if I wasn't already halfway through a panic spiral. For science, I draw a little stack of cash. Turns out, the pen doesn't do money. The cash just evaporates into glitter, which is beautiful, but also useless for paying rent. I spend the rest of the night experimenting. A sketch of a plant turns into a real, live fern that immediately falls off my windowsill. A drawing of a pizza manifests perfectly, toppings and all, but it tastes like cardboard dipped in disappointment. I try to draw a version of me without student debt, but the pen just sputters and makes this sad little noise like it's saying, "Nice try." By 3 a.m., my apartment looks like a fever dream. Half-alive sketches wandering around, and a very confused cat still batting at my shoelaces. The next morning I realized 2 things. 1, The pen only creates what you really mean to create. So any half-hearted doodle becomes a half-hearted reality. 2. The cat is still here. Like, real. It meows at me like it's been here forever. And when I try to explain to it that it's technically a magical accident, it just stares at me like, okay. And so now I'm sitting here, trying to figure out what to do with a possibly enchanted pen and a self-aware doodle cat that has somehow claimed my favorite blanket as its throne. Part of me is like, this is amazing. You could do so much good with this. But the other part of me, the part that once accidentally deleted an entire client project because I named a file untitled_final2, is like, you're going to ruin the world, aren't you? Anyway, I've got this magic pen and no idea what to do with it. What would you draw if you had a pen that could make anything real, but only if you really meant it? Asking for a friend. So, it started like any other Thursday. I woke up to the sound of my neighbor's chihuahua yapping at some invisible squirrel, which is his personal mission in life. After muttering a very creative string of curses into my pillow, I rolled out of bed, chugged yesterday's cold coffee, because I like my mornings with a side of poor decisions, and debated whether I could get away with wearing the same jeans 3 days in a row. Spoiler, I did. Clients don't come to me for fashion advice. They come for weird, trippy tattoos and existential banter. I headed to the studio early because one of my regulars, Julie, was coming in to get a piece finished, a moth with human eyes. She's a poet and always tells me these intense stories about her time working at a funeral home, so I was looking forward to it. When I got to the studio, though, there was this tiny, vintage-looking tin sitting on the front step. It was dented and covered in faded blue paint, like it had survived the apocalypse. No, just a tin. I picked it up, shook it, and heard a rattle inside. Was it some weird Austin art thing? A prank? Anyway, curiosity won. I popped the lid, and inside was this delicate gold locket. The kind with filigrees so intricate, it looked like it could have been crafted by a time-traveling elf. Inside the locket, instead of a picture, there was a scrap of paper with an address scrawled in the kind of handwriting that screams lives on caffeine and questionable life choices. Normally, I'd leave something like that for the lost and found of the universe, but there was something about it. Maybe it was the romanticism of it, like I was stepping into a Nancy Drew novel where everyone listens to The Cure. So, yeah, I took the tin inside, set up for Julie, and spent the morning obsessively Googling the address. Turns out it wasn't far, just across the river, tucked behind some art supply store I used to haunt. After Julie's session, and her amazing story about a hearse breaking down on prom night, I packed up my gear early, threw the tin in my bag, and hopped on my rusty bike, which I lovingly call Metal Death Trap. When I got to the address, it was this old ivy-covered building that looked like it was auditioning to be in a Wes Anderson film. The kind of place where you half expect to find a secret society holding meetings in candlelight. The front door was painted a dark green that probably had a pretentious name like Pine Whisper, and there was no buzzer, just an ancient brass knocker shaped like a raven. I knocked because of course I did. This older woman answered, maybe in her late 60s, wearing a caftan with more colors than a Lisa Frank fever dream. She had the kind of energy that made you think she knew what your aura looked like. Before I could explain anything, she looked at me and said, "Ah, you've brought it back. Good." Like what? She invited me inside, and let me tell you, her place was a sensory overload in the best way possible. Shelves crammed with books, walls covered in art that felt alive, and the faint smell of sage and something floral I couldn't quite place. She introduced herself as Marisol and motioned for me to sit on this velvet armchair that probably cost more than my car. Marisol explained that the locket had belonged to her late sister, an artist who believed every object carried a story. When she passed away, Marisol decided to scatter bits of her sister's collection around the city, hoping they'd find people who could carry the stories forward. Apparently, I'd passed some cosmic vibe check by picking up the tin, and then things got weirder. Marisol asked if I wanted to see her sister's studio. I figured why not? She led me through a narrow hallway to a room that honestly took my breath away. The walls were covered in sketches and paintings, all swirling with surreal, dreamlike imagery. Melting clocks, cities growing out of hands, moons tangled in spiderwebs. It felt familiar, like I'd stumbled into someone else's dream, but recognized all the landmarks. In the center of the room was a table covered in objects: an antique key, a feather dipped in gold, a tiny hourglass. And Marisol told me each one had been left by someone who'd encountered one of her sister's creations. It reminded me of my memory jar at the studio, except hers was a whole museum of stories. She handed me a small, blank canvas and said, "Now it's your turn." I'm not much of a painter, but there was something about the moment, the space, the way the air felt heavy with meaning. I sat down and started sketching without thinking, just letting my hand move. When I finished, it was this abstract design of a woman with stars for eyes, her hair blending into waves that became the skyline of Austin. It wasn't perfect, but it felt right. Marisol smiled when she saw it, like she'd been expecting exactly that. She told me to take the locket with me and add it to my own collection. "It's a bridge," she said, "between your world and hers." Walking out of there felt like stepping back into reality after a really vivid dream. The air was sharper, the colors brighter. I biked home with the locket in my pocket, and when I got back to the studio, I slipped it into my memory jar. It's sitting there now, nestled between a miniature skull someone gave me and a broken compass that allegedly never pointed north. I keep thinking about Marisol's sister, about the way art connects people in these invisible, magical ways. Like we're all part of some sprawling tapestry, even if we only see the threads. So, yeah, that's how a random Thursday turned into this surreal, cinematic adventure. Have you ever had a regular day suddenly turn into an unforgettable adventure? Because I'm starting to think the ordinary days are just waiting for us to notice their magic. You ever had one of those days where life feels like a sitcom pilot, except you're the guy stuck flipping burgers while everyone else gets the good storylines? Yeah, that was me for years. Seattle, rainy as hell, and there I was, head chef at a high-end restaurant, slaving away under some Gordon Ramsay wannabe. Long hours, no recognition, and to top it off, I kept burning my favorite pans because I was too stubborn to admit gas stoves had it out for me. They really did. By the way, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Anyway, all that changed when I finally hit my breaking point. It wasn't some dramatic meltdown, no plates smashed or customers yelled at. It was a Wednesday afternoon, dead shift, and some kid sent back a filet mignon because it wasn't giving medium rare vibes. I stared at the server, the plate, and the meat like I was in a poorly written indie film. That night, I went home, poured myself a whiskey neat because I'm a cliche like that, and started sketching out plans for a food truck on the back of an old grocery receipt. Fast forward 6 months, and I'm the proud owner of the Rolling Mess, a food truck specializing in experimental comfort food. It's like regular comfort food, but with a twist, and sometimes that twist is just a spectacular failure. Think mac and cheese with a hint of lavender. Sounds fancy, right? Until the lavender overpowers everything, and it tastes like you're chewing on potpourri. Yeah, that one made it into the journal. Lavender disaster number 2, I called it. The regulars loved hearing about it, though. Turns out, people enjoy knowing their chef screws up as much as they do. The truck's parked near Pike Place most days, right where the tourists flock and the seagulls have no chill. Business is good, not restaurant good, but enough to keep me afloat. And the best part? I'm my own boss. No one's breathing down my neck about plating techniques or whether the garnish is Instagram worthy. Well, except for the occasional customer who's way too into food photography. I had one lady spend 10 minutes adjusting the angle of her phone to get the perfect shot of her chili dog nachos. It's a chili dog, Karen. Just eat it. Not everything's perfect, though. My truck's got personality, which is code for it breaks down at the worst times. Like last month, when the engine decided to die in the middle of the highway during rush hour. I had to push the thing onto the shoulder while a line of honking cars serenaded me. A cop showed up, probably thinking I was some lunatic who stole a taco truck, and I had to explain that yes, this rusty heap was my livelihood. The people who visit the truck are a mixed bag. Tourists, locals, foodies, and the occasional weirdo who thinks tipping in Bitcoin is a solid idea. But my favorite customers are the regulars. There's Jenny, who orders grilled cheese and tomato soup every single Friday like clockwork. She says it reminds her of home, which, given the rainy backdrop of Seattle, probably means her childhood was a constant cycle of cozy nostalgia. Then there's Tim, a barista who's always in a rush, but never too rushed to compliment my killer seasoning game. High praise from a guy who makes art out of coffee foam. Oh, and I can't forget Dale, the retired engineer who treats my truck like a second home. He once brought me a handmade spice rack because he said he couldn't stand watching me dig through the chaos of my storage bins. Dale's a lifesaver. He's also the reason I learned the hard way not to experiment with ghost peppers unless you're ready for grown men to cry in public. Running a food truck has taught me more about people than years in the kitchen ever did. Like how food isn't just about taste, it's about connection. People don't just come to eat. They come to talk, laugh, and sometimes vent about their day. I've heard stories that would make your head spin, breakups, promotions, even a marriage proposal once. The guy was sweating bullets, and his girlfriend almost choked on her lobster roll when he got down on one knee. She said yes, by the way, lobster roll engagement is what I call that story. Not all days are great though. The weather can kill your vibe real quick. One time, it rained so hard the truck started leaking, and I had to use duct tape to keep the water out. The customers didn't care. They just stood there under umbrellas, munching on burgers like nothing was wrong. Seattle people are built different, I swear. The truck's become my therapy in a way. When I mess up a dish, it's not the end of the world anymore. I write it down in the journal, laugh about it with the customers, and move on. Like the time I tried to make truffle fries, but accidentally used cocoa powder instead of truffle salt. They looked fancy as hell, but tasted like regret. Chocolate regret fries is still one of the most requested entries from the journal. People love a good disaster story, especially when they're not the ones who have to eat it. Some nights, after the truck's closed and the city's quiet, I sit in the back with a beer, looking out at the rain-soaked streets. It's not glamorous, but it feels right. I think about all the people I've fed, all the stories I've heard, and all the mistakes that led me here. If I could go back, I'd still walk out of that restaurant kitchen. Because here, in my little food truck with its unreliable engine and experimental menu, I've found something better than success. I've found joy. You ever have one of those days where life's just shuffling along, and out of nowhere, you trip over some memory that grabs you by the collar and says, "Hey, remember when?" Happened to me last Tuesday. It was one of those gray, drizzly afternoons where time feels like it's been slowed down just for kicks. I was in the back of the shop, sorting through a box of records someone had traded in. Mostly junk, let's be honest. A lot of scratched up copies of Rumors, because apparently every family in America bought one in the 70s. A Bee Gees album with a cover so water damaged it looked like it had survived a flood, and a handful of oddball country singles. Then I saw it. Buried at the bottom was a cassette tape. Not just any cassette tape, though. It was one of those homemade mixtapes, the kind with a little rectangle of white paper on it where somebody had scribbled the track list in pen. Half the ink was smudged, but I could still make out a few songs. Jesse's Girl, Every Breath You Take, and a couple of deep cuts by the Cars. Whoever made this thing had good taste, I'll give him that. It even had a title scrawled across the top. Driving Tunes 83. Man, I don't know what came over me, but holding that tape, it was like I'd just been handed a time machine. I hadn't seen a mixtape like that in decades. My mind went straight back to the summer of 1983, which by my humble estimation was the single greatest year in human history. Or maybe I just think that because I was 29, broke as hell, and having the time of my life. I had this beat-up Datsun 280Z that was held together with duct tape and prayer, and the tape deck was so temperamental you had to sweet-talk it just to play a song without chewing up the tape. But that car? That car felt like freedom. I remember blasting down some country road with my windows down, that hot Tennessee air hitting me square in the face, while Jesse's Girl played at full volume. It was a summer of late-night drives to nowhere in particular, sneaking into drive-in movies with a six-pack stashed under the passenger seat, and getting the kind of sunburn that makes you think, well, I'm probably going to regret this at 40. Turns out I did. My dermatologist gives me the side eye every time I walk into her office. But what really hit me, holding that mixtape, wasn't just the songs or the summer air or even the car. It was this weird, unshakable feeling of possibility. Like the world was huge and every door was still wide open. There were no smartphones back then, no endless scrolling or curated playlists telling you what you should listen to. It was just you, the road, and whatever random songs you'd thrown together. It was messy and imperfect, and completely yours. Anyway, I didn't get much work done that afternoon. I spent the next hour rummaging around the shop for my old cassette player, which, believe it or not, still works, unlike my knees. When I finally got the tape to play, it sounded like it had been recorded underwater, but it didn't matter. I just closed my eyes and let the music take me somewhere else for a while. And here's the kicker. At the end of the tape, there was a crackly recording of somebody's voice. A girl's voice, soft and shy, like she wasn't used to talking into a microphone. She said, "Hey, I hope you like this tape. I made it for you to remember me by. Don't forget me, okay?" I don't know who she was or who she made the tape for, but I'd bet my last piece of gum she's someone's Jesse's girl. And now I can't stop wondering, did the person she gave this to ever listen to her message? Did they keep the tape? Did they forget her anyway? Funny how something so small, a smudged up mixtape in a box of junk, can pack such a punch. It's like it reached out and shook hands with some part of me I hadn't talked to in years. Nostalgia's a sneaky little thing, isn't it? It doesn't tap you on the shoulder and ask politely if it can stay a while. It just barges in, kicks its feet up on your coffee table, and says, "Hey, let's hang out." I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's nice to be reminded of a time when life felt simple. Not easier, necessarily, but simpler. You weren't trying to juggle a dozen things at once, or keep up with a world that moves faster than it probably should. You were just living. So, what about you? What small, randomly found things bring you a moment of calm nostalgia? The subject line read, "Congratulations, you're invited," followed by my name and a date and time. I almost deleted it, assuming it was spam, but curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single sentence. "If you want to see the city like you never have before, meet at the Midnight Tower, rooftop, 8 p.m., dress warmly." I blinked at the screen. The Midnight Tower was one of the city's oldest skyscrapers, a stone fortress from another era. I'd walked past it countless times, but never thought much about it. No one I knew had ever been to the top. It was just another corporate building, mostly empty these days. Still, I couldn't ignore the pull of mystery, and after a bit of inner debate, I decided to go. At precisely 8 p.m., bundled up against the winter chill, I found myself in the dimly lit lobby of the Midnight Tower. The building felt massive and deserted, the kind of place where whispers might linger in the marble hallways. A security guard sat behind the desk, and as soon as he saw me, he nodded knowingly. "8th floor. Take the elevator to the top from there," he said, handing me an old-fashioned brass key. The strangeness of it all sent a thrill down my spine. I rode the elevator to the 8th floor, where I found another door and used the key. Behind it was a staircase, the walls lined with flickering, battery-powered lanterns. I climbed until I reached the very top, my breath misting in the cold air as I pushed open a final door and stepped out onto the rooftop. The sight took my breath away. The whole city stretched below, twinkling with lights that blurred in the faint mist. And standing there, scattered around the rooftop, was a small group of people, strangers, all bundled in coats and scarves, looking out over the edge in silence. In the middle of them was a tall, wiry man with gray hair and a green scarf, looking like someone from another time. "Welcome," he said, his voice carrying across the rooftop. "You've all been invited here because you're ready to see something most people miss. My name is Ewan, and tonight, I'll be your guide to the hidden city." He didn't explain further, just waved us closer to the edge, where a telescope had been set up. One by one, he had us look through it, pointing in specific directions at certain buildings or intersections. I was the last in line, watching as each person took their turn, looked through the lens, and then backed away with a look of awe or confusion. Finally, it was my turn. Ewan directed me to look down toward the intersection of Hudson and Maple, where a closed-down theater had been sitting empty for years. But through the telescope, I saw something impossible. The theater wasn't empty. The marquee was lit up, shining with the words, "Tonight only, Midnight Masquerade." A line of people dressed in elaborate costumes stretched down the block, laughing, chatting, their faces hidden behind intricate masks. I pulled back from the telescope, my mind spinning. That can't be right. That theater's been shut for years. Ewan just smiled. "What you're seeing is the city's hidden self. the part that lives in between. Sometimes, if you're in the right place, you can catch a glimpse of it, as if the city is letting you in on a secret. And tonight, it's inviting you to be part of it. I glanced around, and I could tell I wasn't the only one confused or skeptical. A few people were murmuring, wondering if this was some elaborate prank. But Ewan raised a hand, silencing us. Every city has a side that most people never see. It exists in the overlooked corners, in the reflections, in the spaces just outside the edges of our perception. You've all been invited tonight because you've noticed these things before, even if you didn't realize it. And now, you'll get a chance to experience it for real. He pointed to a narrow stairwell that led down into the building, hidden in the far corner of the rooftop. Follow that, and it'll take you where you need to go. Trust me, and keep your mind open. You'll know what to do. One by one, people filed down the narrow stairs. Part of me still thought I should turn back, go home, and chalk it up to a weird night. But the other part, the part that had always wondered about the strange coincidences, the little mysteries of the city, wanted to know where this would lead. I descended the stairs, following the line of people down a dimly lit corridor that seemed to stretch longer than the building itself. The air grew warmer, and I started to hear faint music drifting through the walls, echoing like whispers. Finally, the hallway opened into a large, dim room that looked like a speakeasy from a dream. Red velvet curtains lined the walls, soft, golden lights hung from the ceiling, and vintage music played from a gramophone in the corner. People were gathered around small tables, chatting, sipping from champagne glasses. But what caught my attention was the variety of faces, some familiar, others strange. There were people dressed in everything from modern suits to outfits from decades, even centuries past. I spotted someone in a Victorian gown, a man in a 1920s fedora, a woman in a disco jumpsuit. It was as if time itself had gathered here, each person looking completely at ease in their chosen era. A young woman in a feathered headband approached me with a smile. "First time?" she asked, handing me a glass filled with something warm and spicy. It always takes people a bit to get used to it. I took a sip, feeling the warmth spread through me. What is this place?" She laughed, a soft musical sound. "This is the Hidden City. It's the part of the city that doesn't belong to any one time or place. People come here from all over and from all different years. Some stay for a night, some longer. It's not exactly a club, but it's also not a place you'll find on any map." I noticed a couple dancing in the corner, their movements fluid and graceful, though they wore clothes that looked like they were from completely different eras. It was surreal, but it felt oddly familiar, like a dream I'd forgotten. "Why was I invited here?" I asked. She looked thoughtful, as if trying to choose her words. "Because you notice the details. Most people walk through the city and see it as just a place to live or work. But a few people see it for what it really is, a story, one that's always unfolding. If you've been invited, it means the city has chosen you as one of its storytellers, someone who'll keep its secrets alive." A sense of purpose filled me, an inexplicable feeling that I was meant to be here, even if I couldn't understand how or why. We spent hours in that room, swapping stories, sharing glimpses into each other's lives. Each person had a tale, a memory, a piece of the city's soul to offer. And as I listened, I felt as if I were collecting fragments of something vast and ancient, like I was piecing together a mosaic of the city's hidden history. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes, I was standing back on the rooftop, alone, with the first rays of dawn spilling over the skyline. The telescope, the strangers, even Ewan were all gone, leaving me with nothing but the silence of the empty rooftop and the faint echo of music still lingering in my mind. I made my way down the stairs and out onto the street, half convinced it had all been a dream. But as I walked through the city that morning, I felt different, like I could see the invisible threads that connected every corner, every hidden alley and forgotten street. I knew that the hidden city was still there, waiting just beneath the surface, and that one day, when I least expected it, it would call me back. So, here's my question to you. Have you ever felt like there's a secret side to the places you know, waiting to be discovered? It was an unplanned night, one of those Fridays where everyone had bailed last minute, leaving me alone at a pub that looked like it was slowly fading into history. The place was a relic from the 70s, complete with peeling wallpaper and neon beer signs that buzzed more than they lit. It wasn't exactly my first choice, but the beer was cheap, and I'd already committed to showing up. The place was nearly empty except for a couple of regulars at the bar, quietly nursing their drinks as if in some unspoken pact of solitude. I had just settled into a booth with my pint, half wondering if I should call it an early night, when I noticed someone walk in, her eyes scanning the room like she was searching for a secret only she knew about. She was striking, not in the way that usually makes heads turn, but more in the way you notice someone and can't look away, as if they've got this invisible pull. She wore a dark jacket, hands stuffed into her pockets, and had this faint, almost curious smile that made her look like she was part of the place's forgotten stories. Her gaze landed on me for a second, and for a split moment, I thought she might join me. Instead, she went to the bar and ordered a drink, leaning against the counter as if she were waiting for something. I figured she'd settle down in a booth or maybe leave as quickly as she'd come in, but when her drink arrived, she looked right over at me with a subtle nod, like she was daring me to do something. Feeling bold, or maybe just tired of spending the night alone, I grabbed my pint and walked over. "Is this seat taken?" I asked, feeling slightly ridiculous, but too curious to back down. She smirked, an eyebrow arched in a playful challenge. "Depends. You here to talk or to drink?" "Little bit of both, maybe," I replied, sitting down before she could tell me otherwise. I raised my glass in a mock toast, and she mirrored the gesture with a small smile. "To unexpected company," I said. "To curiosity," she replied, clinking her glass against mine. We didn't start with names, just easy, unfiltered conversation about nothing in particular. I learned she was new in town, passing through, she said, like she wasn't planning to stick around too long. She asked me about the bar, about what it was like living in a city where everyone seemed to be in a hurry. And even though I barely knew her, I found myself telling her things I didn't usually share with strangers, about my job that felt like it was draining the life out of me, about the way I'd been feeling restless, as if waiting for something to shift. She listened, genuinely, like every word mattered, and when I paused, she didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, she looked at me thoughtfully and asked, "So, what's stopping you from making that shift?" It wasn't the kind of question you expect from someone you've known for less than an hour. I laughed, a little caught off guard. "I guess I'm waiting for the right time, you know? Or maybe I'm just comfortable." She tilted her head, as if pondering that. "Comfortable? Huh," she echoed, her tone carrying a hint of disbelief. "I don't know. You don't strike me as the comfortable type. More like someone who's itching to get out of his own skin." The way she said it, without a hint of judgment, hit me deeper than I expected. "You make that sound like a bad thing," I replied, smiling but feeling a little exposed. She shook her head. "No, not bad. Just familiar. Maybe because I know what it's like to want something different." We sat in silence for a while after that, the kind that wasn't awkward but felt more like a truce. There was something about her, this quiet intensity, a sense of purpose beneath the surface, that made me want to know more. But I could tell she wasn't the type to lay it all out, so I let it be, letting the conversation drift to lighter topics. At some point, she glanced at the old jukebox in the corner, a relic of another era, and her eyes lit up. "Do you think it still works?" she asked, standing up and walking over before I could even answer. I watched as she rifled through the song list, her fingers hovering over the buttons, until she finally made a choice. After a few seconds of crackling static, a slow, haunting tune filled the room, echoing through the nearly empty bar. She turned to me, smiling, and gestured for me to join her. "Dance with me?" she asked, her hand outstretched, and for a second, I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. But something in her eyes made me stand up, closing the gap between us. I took her hand, and we began swaying to the music, our movements tentative at first but slowly falling into rhythm. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I could feel her breathing, slow and steady, as if she were fully, deeply present in this one strange moment. The song was some old jazz piece, soft and melancholy, filling the air with a kind of nostalgia, I couldn't place. "Do you ever wonder," she murmured, her voice barely audible over the music, "what it would be like to just disappear? Leave everything behind and start over somewhere no one knows you?" The question lingered in the air between us, and for a moment, I felt a pang of longing I hadn't realized was there. I think about it sometimes. I admitted, my voice equally quiet. But it's hard to actually do it, to let go of everything. She looked up at me then, her eyes searching mine. Maybe it's easier than we think. Maybe the hardest part is just convincing ourselves we deserve something different. I wanted to ask her what she meant, to dig deeper, but before I could say anything, the song ended, and she pulled away, her expression soft but unreadable. She glanced at the clock on the wall, and I sensed that whatever spell had brought us together was about to end. "I should go," she said, her voice carrying a note of finality that surprised me. I felt an unexpected tightness in my chest. "Will I see you again?" I asked, half hoping she'd laugh it off, maybe offer a casual see you around. But she just smiled, the kind of smile that held 1,000 unspoken words. "Maybe," she said, "or maybe this was just supposed to be a one-time thing. One of those nights you remember, just because it was different." She leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek, and I caught a faint trace of her perfume, a mix of something floral and earthy, a scent that would stay with me long after she'd gone. She pulled back, her hand lingering on mine for just a second longer than necessary. "Take care of yourself, okay?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and before I could respond, she turned and walked out, disappearing into the night without a backward glance. I sat back down at the booth, staring at the empty glass she'd left behind, feeling both hollow and strangely full, like I'd been given a glimpse of something fleeting and precious. The bartender gave me a nod, as if he'd seen it all before, as if he understood. As I left the bar that night, I found myself looking down each street I passed, half expecting to catch a glimpse of her dark jacket, her unmistakable silhouette. But she was gone, leaving me with nothing but the memory of a quiet dance and a question I couldn't shake. And even though I knew I might never see her again, I had the feeling that, somehow, she'd changed something in me. It was subtle, like a door I hadn't noticed was now open, waiting for me to decide if I had the courage to step through. It began on an early Sunday morning with a note taped to my front door. I was groggy, barely awake, and honestly thought it might be a flyer or a misplaced package notice. But it was a handwritten note on yellowed paper, sealed with an old-fashioned wax stamp that looked like something out of a historical drama. My name was written on the outside in elegant, swooping letters, and below it were the words, "Meet me at the old lighthouse at 10 a.m. Bring only what you need to see clearly." I didn't know anyone who would pull a stunt like this. In fact, no one I knew would ever refer to a need to see clearly. It was strange, like a line from a fairy tale or a half-remembered dream. But curiosity, as it often does, got the better of me. I glanced at my watch. It was already 8:30 a.m., and the lighthouse was on the edge of town, about an hour's walk. So, instead of spending my lazy Sunday morning the way I'd planned, in bed with a book and a steady stream of coffee, I grabbed my old binoculars, slipped into my shoes, and headed toward the coast, my mind buzzing with questions. The air was brisk, and the sun had just started to rise over the trees, casting a soft golden light on the path ahead. When I arrived at the lighthouse, I noticed right away that it was empty. The place was old, abandoned for years, its red and white stripes faded from the salt and wind. Yet there was something quietly majestic about it, standing alone on the cliffs like a guardian of the sea. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the air inside was cool and damp, filled with the scent of the ocean. The narrow spiral staircase wound up into the darkness, each step echoing as I climbed. I reached the top, and as I stepped out onto the viewing deck, the first thing I noticed was a small, glass bottle set in the center of the floor. Inside the bottle was a rolled-up piece of paper, secured with a thin piece of string. I knelt down, took out the paper, and unfurled it. The handwriting was neat, delicate, and strangely familiar. It read, "To find what you're looking for, you must look beyond the obvious. Begin where the land meets the sea, and follow the path where shadows grow." I read it twice, my mind racing. Was this some kind of treasure hunt? Or a prank? But something about it felt sincere, almost like a calling. I tucked the note into my pocket and scanned the coastline with my binoculars, searching for anything that might give me a clue. From the deck, I could see a narrow trail that hugged the edge of the cliffs, leading down to a secluded cove I'd never noticed before. The path was overgrown, framed by scraggly trees that cast long shadows even in the morning light. It felt eerie, like stepping into another world, but I was hooked. So, I made my way down the trail, following the twists and turns as the landscape changed from rocky cliffs to sandy dunes, until finally I reached the cove. There, nestled between two large rocks, was an old leather-bound journal, its cover soft and worn, with a single letter embossed on the front. L. I picked it up carefully, brushing off the sand, and opened it to the first page. Inside, there was another note, this one handwritten in the same delicate script. For the finder, this journal belonged to someone who once searched for meaning in places most would overlook. It is filled with their thoughts, observations, and secrets, some of which may be yours as well. A shiver ran down my spine as I turned the pages. The entries were dated, starting in 1932, and each one detailed small, almost meditative observations about the world. The handwriting described the feeling of waves crashing, the patterns of seagulls, the texture of driftwood. But as I read further, the entries began to hint at something deeper, something the writer was chasing. Not just beauty, but a truth, something hidden beneath the surface of ordinary life. I don't know how long I stayed there, sitting in the sand and reading, but the whole world seemed to fade away as I lost myself in the pages. Eventually, I reached an entry that stopped me cold. To whomever finds this, if you've come this far, you're seeking something. I was too. But what I learned is this: the answers we look for are often hidden within the questions we carry. In the end, I realized it wasn't about finding something tangible. It was about finding the courage to keep looking. I looked up, feeling a strange ache in my chest. The note felt like it was speaking to me directly, like the writer had known that someone, someday, would be sitting in that same spot, searching for something they couldn't quite name. As I sat there, lost in thought, I felt a presence beside me. I turned and saw an elderly man standing a few feet away, watching me with a quiet smile. He wore a simple coat and a hat that looked older than he was, his eyes bright and curious. "Looks like you found something," he said, nodding to the journal in my hands. I nodded, suddenly at a loss for words. Did you leave this here?" He chuckled softly. "Not me, but someone who meant a great deal to me. They used to come here, searching for answers they never quite found. But they left this behind, hoping it would help someone else find their own." I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded, feeling an odd mixture of gratitude and melancholy. The man looked out at the sea, his gaze distant, as if he were watching something only he could see. "Sometimes," he said, "we don't find what we're looking for because we're afraid to look within. But out here by the sea, it's easier, don't you think?" I nodded, understanding what he meant without needing to say a word. He turned to leave, giving me a small wave, and as he walked away, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, like a gentle tide pulling back to reveal something hidden beneath the surface. After he was gone, I sat there for a while longer, staring out at the water, the journal heavy in my lap. I didn't know exactly what I'd found that day, but it felt like a piece of myself I'd forgotten. As I made my way back up the path, I realized that sometimes we're led to places not for answers, but for a kind of quiet companionship with our questions. The journal now sits on my shelf, and every so often, I'll read a page, letting the words remind me of that day. It's a strange feeling, like being tethered to something both ancient and timeless, something that exists within all of us but is rarely seen. So, have you ever stumbled upon something that seemed meant for you? Or followed a nudge, a whisper, to a place that seemed to open up a new part of yourself? I suppose it started with the coffee. Not the smell, though that's part of it. More the ritual of it, the rhythm, the way our mornings were stitched together like a good wool sweater, thread by thread, mug by mug. Before Ruth, I drank coffee like a man on fire. Quick, utilitarian gulps, the heat barely bothering me as I stood at the kitchen sink staring at the Atlantic through the window. But when she moved into the little house by the lighthouse, when we moved into each other's lives, if you'll allow me to get poetic about it, everything about coffee slowed down. She had this old Italian stovetop percolator, something she'd picked up in college from a flea market in Boston. A mocha pot, she called it, rolling the M like it was some magical word. The thing had dents in it, and the handle was cracked and taped back together with black electrical tape, but she swore it made the best coffee in the world. And she was right, of course. Ruth had a way of being right about things that mattered. Every morning, rain or shine, fog or frost, she'd wake before me and start the process. I'd hear her in the kitchen, opening the cabinets, the little shhhhhh of coffee grounds being poured, the scrape of a match striking as she lit the burner. I swear that sound is etched into my soul more than any song ever could be. And then, as the percolator started bubbling, she'd hum to herself, never the same tune twice, always something quiet and lilting, like she was inventing the melody just for that morning. When the coffee was ready, she'd bring the mugs, hers with a chip on the rim, mine a faded navy blue one that said U.S. Lighthouse Service in peeling white letters, and we'd sit on the bench outside, watching the waves. Even in winter, with blankets pulled tight around our shoulders, we'd sit there. The world wasn't awake yet. The fishermen were still prepping their boats. The gulls hadn't begun their screeching, and the ocean just breathed. She'd wrap her hands around the mug, eyes half closed, hair wild from sleep, and say something like, "What do you think that ship out there is carrying today?" She knew I'd bite every time. "That one? Oh, that's a cargo ship headed to Iceland," I'd say, squinting at the shadow of a freighter on the horizon, carrying crates of oranges and maybe a couple of smuggled parrots. Parrots? To Iceland? Well, they got long winters. A parrot might cheer someone up, and she'd laugh, low and soft, the kind of laugh you feel in your ribs. We'd make up stories for every ship that passed. Some were carrying precious jewels. Others were filled with circus performers running away to start a new life. Once, we decided a scrappy little trawler was actually a pirate ship, captained by a woman named Gloria who wore a gold tooth and kept a monkey on her shoulder. It was silly, of course, just idle talk to fill the silence. But those moments, those ships and their imaginary cargo, they were ours. Little stories we built together, brick by brick, until they formed something like a lighthouse of their own, shining a soft light into the corners of our days. We kept that ritual for 5 years. Even after she got sick, we clung to it. When walking outside became too hard, we moved to the kitchen table. I'd still let her hum the first tune of the day, still make up ridiculous stories about the ships out there. But the laughter came less often, and her hands around the mug started to look too thin, too pale. There was a moment, I think it was January, when she looked at me over her coffee and said, "I hope there's an ocean wherever I'm going next." And I just nodded, unable to speak, because what do you say to something like that? After Ruth was gone, the house felt too big. I couldn't look at the mocha pot without feeling like my chest was caving in, so I put it on the top shelf of the cabinet, where I wouldn't have to see it every day. But I still made coffee each morning, still sat outside with the waves. I'd imagine her next to me, humming, pointing at a distant ship, and asking what it was carrying. At first, the stories were hard to come by. I'd sit there with my mug growing cold in my hands, my throat too tight to come up with anything. But over time, the words came back. I think Ruth would have been proud of that. A few months ago, I took the mocha pot down from the cabinet. It was dusty, and the handle was still taped up, but I cleaned it, filled it with coffee grounds, and set it on the stove. The sound it made, the little bubbling song as the water boiled through the grounds, made me close my eyes and lean against the counter for a long time. I brought the coffee outside, sat on the bench, and told Ruth about the ship I saw that morning. A sleek black vessel heading south, probably to New York, carrying a mysterious violinist and 100 roses in its cargo hold. I like to think she would have laughed. So now I'm here, sitting in my kitchen after another foggy Maine morning, wondering if other people have these little rituals, these small things that stitch their lives together. Maybe it's not coffee. Maybe it's something else. Tuesday night pasta dinners, or dancing barefoot in the living room after work. Whatever it is, I'd love to hear it. What little rituals add warmth to your relationships? It all started with a cup of coffee I didn't even want, which is ironic because, I'm a barista. I live and breathe caffeine. The whole thing went down last Tuesday during my shift at Joe's Beans. Yes, that's the real name of the place. Our regulars either think it's quirky or a crime against branding. I'm in the latter camp, but my opinions don't exactly weigh heavily in the naming rights department. So there I am, 3 hours into my shift, running on 2 hours of sleep and pure sarcasm. I'd stayed up the night before writing new material for my stand-up set. And by writing, I mean convincing myself that Googling funny things people hate about New York was the same as brainstorming. Spoiler, it wasn't. Anyway, Tuesday mornings are slow, mostly writers in ironic glasses nursing oat lattes and avoiding their deadlines. It's the kind of crowd that makes me feel like I should charge for Wi-Fi instead of coffee. Right before my break, I made myself a cappuccino. It was one of those beautiful, Instagram-worthy ones with a perfect little heart in the foam. Then, like an idiot, I left it on the counter while I ran to the back to grab my notebook. When I came back, the cup was gone. At first, I thought someone threw it away, but nope, it was very much in the hands of an old man sitting at the corner table. Now, when I say old, I don't mean grandpa, who still runs 5Ks old. I mean ancient. Like this guy probably witnessed the invention of drip coffee firsthand. He was wearing a fraying tweed jacket that smelled faintly of mothballs and a beret tilted so perfectly I almost forgave him for stealing my drink. Almost. I walked over, notebook in hand, ready to confront him. Not in a rude way, just something like, "Hey, did you maybe mistake that cappuccino for yours?" But before I could open my mouth, he looked up at me and said, "Ah, there you are. See?" And I did. I don't know why, but I sat. It's like the guy had some sort of Jedi mind trick power. He slid the coffee cup across the table and said, "I borrowed this to save you from yourself." Now, at this point, I'm torn between laughing and asking if he escaped from a local improv theater. "Save me from myself?" I said, leaning back in the chair. "What? Were you worried I was going to foam art myself into oblivion?" He ignored my snark entirely, which, honestly, I respected. "You're running," he said, "but you don't know where. Happens to everyone your age. It's why the coffee tastes bitter." Okay, so first of all, the coffee didn't taste bitter. I know because I made it, and I've got a solid B+ track record. Second, what does that even mean? But before I could argue, he started telling me this story. About his younger days as a painter in Paris, of course, because why not go full cliche while we're here? He talked about how he spent years chasing fame, grinding through commissions for tourist shops, thinking that if he just got his big break, everything would click. Spoiler alert, it didn't. One day, he said, I threw my brushes in the Seine. He mimed the gesture dramatically, like he was auditioning for a role as grumpy old artist number 3. I was so tired of painting for others. But the next morning, I bought new brushes because I missed painting for me. I stared at him, partly because the story was actually interesting, and partly because I didn't know what the hell it had to do with my cappuccino. "So, what? You're saying I should throw something in the East River?" "No," he said, smiling faintly. "I'm saying you need to stop worrying so much about the destination. A good journey? That's enough." Then he picked up the cup, drained it in one impossibly dramatic sip, and walked out. I sat there for a minute, stunned, before realizing I'd just gotten life advice from a guy who steals drinks and smells like vintage furniture. But here's the thing, it stuck with me. I kept replaying his words while wiping tables, making lattes, even during my comedy set that night. And that's when it hit me, my comedy. It wasn't fun anymore. I was so focused on making it that I forgot why I loved it in the first place. The dumb rush of saying something weird on stage and hearing people laugh. The joy of bombing spectacularly because, hey, at least I tried. Somewhere along the way, I turned it into another grind like rent or taxes. So the next day, I did something wild. I wrote a set that wasn't trying to be clever or crowd-pleasing. It was just me riffing about awkward encounters and weird customers. And you know what? It killed. Not Netflix special killed, but enough to remind me why I fell in love with stand-up in the first place. Now, every time I make a cappuccino, I think about that old guy. About how a forgotten cup of coffee turned into a weird existential pep talk. And yeah, I'm still chasing the dream. But I'm also chasing the fun, the chaos, the moments that make life feel less like a to-do list and more like, I don't know, an improv scene. Ever had one of those moments where something small, a look, a phrase, even a cup of coffee, just clicks in your brain and changes everything? Because, man, I didn't even know I needed it until it happened.